In the year 1035, England did not erupt in war. It did not collapse under rebellion. It did not light the fires of conquest. Instead, it held its breath. A king had died and no one knew who would take the throne. Royal halls remained open, laws still spoken, taxes still collected. Yet the voice that once guided them was gone. The empire forged by Cnut the Great, spanning England, Denmark, and Norway, suddenly existed without its anchor. Across the North Sea, the rightful heir was trapped by conflict. Within England, another son waited silent, patient, unseen. He did not raise an army. He did not proclaim himself. He did not strike. He simply stayed. History would remember him as Harald Harefoot, a name that belies the quiet weight of his reign. For 5 years, in the shadows of uncertainty, he held England together. This is not a tale of heroism, not a story of tyranny. It is the story of power arriving where hesitation lingered. Tonight, we uncover the reign of England's forgotten king, and the silence that allowed him to rule. In late autumn of the year 1035, something rare happened in England. Nothing happened. No invasion crossed the sea. No army marched inland. No banners were raised in rebellion. And yet power vanished. King Cnut the Great, ruler of England, Denmark, and Norway, was dead. His empire, one of the largest northern Europe had ever seen, still existed on parchment and coin, but the man who held it together was gone. There was no clear announcement of succession. No coronation bells rang. No single voice spoke with unquestioned authority. England continued its daily routines almost by habit. Courts opened. Taxes were collected. Orders were given. But beneath that surface, something fundamental was missing: certainty. In medieval kingdoms, uncertainty was dangerous. Authority was not automatic. A king ruled because people agreed, sometimes reluctantly, that he did. When that agreement fractured, power did not collapse immediately. It thinned. It drifted. It waited for someone to claim it. This moment, quiet, unresolved, undecided, is where our story begins. Because in that silence, while England waited for a rightful heir who could not arrive, another figure remained close at hand. He did not speak loudly. He did not announce ambition. He simply stayed where power was needed. His name was Harold. To understand why England hesitated after Cnut's death, we need to understand how kingship worked in the early 11th century and how fragile it truly was. There were no written constitutions, no fixed inheritance laws, no automatic transfers of power. Blood mattered, but it was not enough. A king had to be accepted by nobles, bishops, military leaders, and regional power brokers. Without their recognition, even the most legitimate heir could be ignored. England had learned this lesson repeatedly. For decades before Cnut, the throne had changed hands through conquest, negotiation, and betrayal. Danish armies had ruled, fallen, and returned. English kings had been crowned, exiled, and restored. Stability was recent and personal. Cnut understood this reality better than anyone. He ruled not just as a conqueror, but as a careful manager of loyalty. He rewarded English nobles. He respected the church. He balanced Danish and Anglo-Saxon interests. But Cnut made one critical mistake. He never made his succession unmistakably clear. When he died, he left behind not a system but a question. And questions in medieval politics rarely stayed unanswered for long. Cnut's empire looked impressive on maps. England, Denmark, Norway, all under one crown. But appearances can deceive. This was not an empire held together by shared institutions or permanent unity. It was held together by Cnut himself. His reputation, his authority, his ability to intimidate enemies and reward allies, these were the real foundations of his power. When Cnut traveled, the empire moved with him. When he spoke, decisions followed. When he punished, no one doubted his reach. But when he died, the empire did not inherit his strength. Each region immediately faced its own reality. Denmark worried about invasion. Norway had never been fully secure. And England, wealthy but divided, found itself waiting for direction that never came. The throne was not empty in theory, Cnut had sons, but in practice it was vacant. And in medieval politics, absence mattered more than legality. The longer England waited, the more power pooled around whoever could act, decide, and command, even quietly. This was not the collapse of a kingdom. It was something subtler. It was drift. Cnut left behind two sons who could plausibly claim England, and neither offered an easy solution. The first was Harthacnut, born to Queen Emma of Normandy. His claim was strong, legitimate, and widely recognized. His mother was a powerful political figure, respected across Europe. On paper, Harthacnut was the obvious choice. But Harthacnut was not in England. He was in Denmark, fighting to hold his own throne against rivals who sensed weakness after Cnut's death. Leaving Denmark meant risking everything. Staying meant losing England. The second son was Harald, known later as Harefoot. Harold's legitimacy was complicated. His mother, Aelfgifu of Northampton, may not have been a formally crowned queen. Chroniclers would later question his birth. But Harold had one advantage that mattered enormously. He was present. He lived among England's nobles. He understood local politics. He was close enough to act. This was not a choice between good and evil or strong and weak. It was a choice between rightful absence and questionable presence. England hesitated. Harold did not. Harold did not seize the throne in a dramatic moment. There was no declaration, no sudden coronation, no claim shouted from a balcony. Instead, Harold waited, and waiting became his strategy. At first, he was acknowledged only as a temporary solution, a caretaker, a regent, someone to manage affairs until Harthacnut could arrive. This arrangement felt reasonable, safe, temporary, but temporary power has a habit of settling in. Harold began overseeing royal resources. He influenced appointments. He listened more than he spoke. He allowed others to believe they were guiding him while quietly becoming essential. Weeks passed, then months. England adapted to his presence. Orders signed in his name felt increasingly normal. Resistance required effort, coordination, and risk, and none of those came easily in uncertain times. By the time some realized what was happening, Harold no longer looked like a placeholder. He looked like a king in practice, if not yet in name. This is how power often moves in history, not with force, but with familiarity. And as England adjusted to Harold's quiet authority, the cost of removing him slowly grew higher than the cost of accepting him. The silence had chosen its ruler. By the early months of 1036, something subtle had changed in England. People had stopped asking when Harthacnut would arrive, not because they had chosen Harold, but because daily life had adjusted around him. Royal messengers now carried orders issued in Harold's name. Local officials waited for his approval. Coins continued to circulate without interruption. The machinery of government did not pause. It rarely did. This is how legitimacy begins to form, not through ceremony, but through repetition. Harold attended councils quietly. He did not dominate discussions, he listened. He remembered names. He learned who mattered and who merely spoke loudly. To some nobles he seemed harmless, to others useful, to a few dangerous. No one yet called him king, but no one acted without him either. The absence of conflict created an illusion of stability. England was not burning, so many assumed it was safe. But underneath that calm, lines were being drawn not between armies but between loyalties. Those who benefited from Harold's growing authority found reasons to support him. Those who doubted his legitimacy hesitated, waiting for a clearer moment. And the longer they waited, the more real Harold became. Not everyone was willing to wait. Queen Emma of Normandy understood power too well to ignore what was happening. She had survived court politics for decades. She had been queen to two kings. She knew silence could be more dangerous than rebellion. From her position in southern England, Emma watched Harold's influence grow, and she recognized the pattern immediately. This was how rightful heirs lost thrones. Emma was not merely a mother defending her son. She was a political operator defending a system that depended on legitimacy. If Harold succeeded, it would mean that blood, marriage, and law could be quietly overridden by convenience. She began to act. Messages were sent across the channel. Allies were contacted in Normandy. Supporters within England were reminded where true authority lay. Documents were issued in her name, invoking her son Harthacnut's claim. But Emma faced a problem she could not solve easily. Words traveled slower than power. Every day Harold remained in control made her position weaker. Every order he issued normalized his rule, and every noble who accepted his authority, even temporarily, drifted further from her cause. Emma was fighting not an enemy, but time, and time in England was slipping away from her. Across the North Sea, Harthacnut faced a cruel dilemma. To sail for England meant leaving Denmark vulnerable. His enemies knew this. They watched his ships. They counted his soldiers. They waited for him to make a mistake. If he stayed, England would drift further from him. If he left, Denmark might collapse. This was the cost of inherited empire. In earlier centuries, kings ruled single kingdoms. Now, power stretched across water, distance, and time. And distance weakened claims faster than blood strengthened them. Harthacnut sent assurances, promises, plans, but promises do not rule kingdoms. England did not rebel in his name. It did not pause its administration. It did not refuse Harold's authority, and that silence spoke louder than open defiance. Harold understood this instinctively. He never criticized his half-brother publicly. He allowed England to believe this arrangement was temporary, even as he quietly shaped it into something permanent. In medieval politics, the man who waits at the door often enters the room before the rightful owner returns. And Harthacnut, watching from afar, could feel the door closing. Harold's authority grew, but something was missing. There was no coronation, no anointing by the church, no ritual affirmation of divine approval. To modern eyes, this might seem unimportant, but in the 11th century it mattered deeply. Kingship was not only political, it was sacred. A crown without blessing was incomplete. Harold ruled without ceremony, and everyone noticed. Some nobles tolerated him because he was useful, others because resistance felt dangerous, but few loved him, fewer trusted him, and yet the system bent. Laws were enforced, taxes collected, justice dispensed. Life continued. This was the uncomfortable truth of Harold's rise. England did not need him to be rightful, only functional. That realization frightened people who understood what it meant. If kings could rule without legitimacy, then legitimacy itself was fragile. Harold had not shattered tradition. He had exposed it. By the end of Harold's first year in power, the tension beneath England's calm had thickened. Emma could not wait longer. Harthacnut could not arrive. And Harold could not retreat. Something had to break. In quiet halls and private chambers, conversations turned darker. Words like removal, security, and loyalty took on sharper meanings. Harold's supporters worried that hesitation would invite challenge. His opponents feared that delay would make resistance impossible. In moments like this, medieval politics rarely chose compromise. They chose an example. Soon, a young man would arrive in England believing his blood protected him, believing that lineage still mattered, believing that the old rules applied. He would be wrong. His name was Alfred Atheling, and his fate would stain Harold's reign forever. The silence that raised a king was about to demand a price. Alfred Atheling crossed the sea believing something very old still mattered. He was the son of a king. He was the brother of a king-in-waiting, and he believed England would recognize him as such. Alfred was not coming to conquer. He brought no army, no banners, no declaration of war. He came with a small household, a handful of companions, and a confidence shaped by birth rather than experience. That confidence would cost him everything. Alfred believed Queen Emma's influence would protect him. He believed noble loyalty still followed bloodlines. Most of all, he believed that England's politics, though tense, still followed rules. He was wrong on all counts. England had changed while Alfred was away. It had grown cautious, suspicious, and afraid of instability. Harold's supporters viewed Alfred not as a prince, but as a spark, something that could ignite conflict simply by existing. And sparks in uncertain times are not welcomed. As Alfred's ship approached the English coast, the silence that once waited for a king now watched for a victim. Alfred did not land in enemy territory. He landed in England. He expected safe conduct. Instead, he was met by men who claimed to protect him, men connected to Earl Godwin, one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom. They offered escort, shelter, guidance. Alfred accepted. This moment, quiet, unremarkable on the surface, was the point of no return. Under the guise of hospitality, Alfred was separated from security, from support, from escape. He was moved inland, away from the coast, away from ships, away from options. Harold did not appear. He did not need to. Power rarely dirties its own hands. As Alfred traveled deeper into England, the tone changed. Guards grew harsher. Food grew scarce. Whispers replaced conversation. The realization came too late. Protection had become custody. What Alfred represented was more dangerous than anything he had done. He was a living alternative, a reminder of legitimacy, a threat simply by breathing. And in a kingdom ruled by quiet fear, reminders were not tolerated. There was no public trial, no proclamation, no formal accusation. Alfred's fate was decided behind closed doors, in conversations history barely recorded. Harold's position was still fragile. A single spark could unravel it. Alfred's presence risked rallying opposition, legitimizing resistance, and reopening the question England had tried so hard to avoid. So the question became brutally simple: remove the man or risk the crown. In medieval politics, morality often bends under fear. Violence becomes preventative. Cruelty becomes practical. The decision was not impulsive. It was calculated. Alfred was to be blinded, a punishment designed to destroy political usefulness without the appearance of execution. A mutilated prince could not rule, could not lead armies, could not inspire loyalty. It was an old method, a quiet one, and it carried a message sharper than any speech. This was no longer a temporary regency. This was rule enforced by terror. The blinding of Alfred Atheling shocked even a hardened age. He was young, unarmed, royal. Accounts describe a brutality so severe that Alfred did not survive long afterward. Whether through infection, trauma, or neglect, he died soon after, his claim extinguished along with his sight. News traveled quickly. England did not erupt in rebellion, but something changed. This was no longer politics conducted in silence. This was violence used to erase legitimacy, and everyone understood what it meant. Harold may not have ordered the act directly. Chroniclers argue, blame shifts, names blur, but responsibility does not disappear so easily. A king is defined not only by what he does, but by what happens to his enemies while he rules. Fear now worked in Harold's favor, but fear leaves scars. It creates obedience without loyalty, compliance without respect. England had accepted Harold out of convenience. Now it obeyed him out of dread, and dread is a fragile foundation for a crown. After Alfred's death, something irreversible settled over Harold's rule. The question of legitimacy no longer mattered in the same way. Violence had answered it, not convincingly, but conclusively. Opposition withdrew into silence. Resistance became private. Survival replaced principle. Harold had secured his position, but at a terrible cost. His name would never be spoken without hesitation. His authority would never feel clean. The absence of coronation, the absence of blessing, the absence of moral clarity, all of it now had a reason. England obeyed him, but it did not forgive him. Queen Emma fled into exile soon after. Harthacnut remained trapped abroad. And Harold, now unchallenged, stood alone at the center of a kingdom that no longer questioned his power, but quietly judged it. This was not the triumph of a king. It was the settling of a sentence. Harald Harefoot would rule England for years to come. But from this moment forward, his reign would be defined not by what he built, but by what he destroyed to keep the throne. And history would remember that. After Alfred Etheling's death, England did something telling. It accepted Harold, not with cheers, not with loyalty, but with resignation. Nobles who had hesitated now aligned themselves openly with Harold's authority. Bishops offered cooperation rather than blessing. Local officials adjusted their oaths. There was no dramatic announcement, just a gradual shift in language. Harold was no longer called regent. He was called king. Still, the absence remained. There was no coronation ceremony to mark the moment, no holy oil, no public affirmation that God himself had chosen this ruler. Harold did not demand these things. He understood something important. Pressing for legitimacy would only draw attention to its absence. So he ruled quietly. England, exhausted by uncertainty, allowed him to. But acceptance without belief creates a brittle peace. People obeyed Harold not because they trusted him, but because they feared what instability might bring next. And fear, once it replaces trust, changes the nature of rule forever. Alfred's death was never publicly celebrated or officially acknowledged. It hung in the background of Harold's reign like a shadow no one named. Chroniclers wrote carefully. Nobles spoke indirectly. Responsibility blurred, but memory did not. Everyone knew what had happened, even if no one said it aloud. This silence served Harold for now. The fewer words spoken, the fewer accusations formed. The kingdom moved forward by not looking backward. That was the unspoken agreement. But silence is not the same as forgetting. Every decision Harold made was quietly measured against Alfred's fate. Every act of authority carried a trace of fear. Loyalty became conditional. Support became cautious. Harold had removed a rival, but he had also created a question that would follow him for the rest of his reign. If a king needed this kind of violence to secure his throne, what kind of king was he? England did not ask this question openly. History would. Harold did not rule like his father. Cnut had been decisive, visible, confident. He projected strength outward and inward. Harald did none of this. Instead, he ruled by balance. He avoided large reforms. He avoided dramatic laws. He avoided war whenever possible. His priority was survival, not greatness. He rewarded loyal nobles carefully, without excess. He avoided offending the church but did not lean on it. He maintained order without expanding authority. This made his reign appear uneventful, but uneventful does not mean stable. Harold's England did not grow stronger. It merely avoided collapse. Wealth was preserved, not expanded. Power was maintained, not reinforced. This was rule designed to leave no trace. And that, too, is a choice. Harold understood that any attempt to reshape England would invite scrutiny, and scrutiny would invite judgment. So he kept the kingdom quiet, quiet enough to last. Strangely, for a man who ruled England, Harold often felt far from it. He did not seek admiration. He did not build legends around his name. He did not invite praise or attention. This was not modesty. It was strategy. Harold understood the danger of being too visible. The more he appeared as king, the more questions would arise. How did he come to power? Who truly backed him? Who might oppose him in secret? So he governed quietly from the shadows. Orders flowed through intermediaries. Justice was administered locally. The king's authority existed, yet his presence was almost invisible. For ordinary people, life under Harold felt unchanged, deliberate, unremarkable, and controlled. A forgotten king was safer than a controversial one, and in a fragile kingdom, safety could be power. But absence carries risk. A ruler who does not inspire loyalty must rely on forgetting, on memory fading. And memory, as history shows, has a way of returning, often when least expected. While England held its breath, the world beyond its shores did not. Across the North Sea, Harthacnut waged war. Rivals tested him. Alliances shifted like sand. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to secure Denmark victory by victory, battle by battle. Every success strengthened Harthacnut's claim and quietly eroded Harold's. News drifted back to England in fragments, whispers of triumph and rumor. Harold's supporters felt unease. If the rightful heir returned with an army, with legitimacy, the fragile acceptance of Harold's rule could collapse overnight. Harold did not panic. He acted with measured precision. He reinforced alliances, scrutinized potential traitors, and ensured the kingdom would hold together should Harthacnut's sails ever appear on the horizon. England's stability depended not on armies but on foresight and vigilance. Yet the tension had shifted. Now it was Harold who waited, who watched, who calculated every move from the shadows. And waiting, as he knew too well, is never without peril. The longer the pause, the greater the danger, for even the quietest king can be undone by the invisible currents of fear and ambition swirling around him. By the middle of Harold's reign, one truth could no longer be ignored. His grip on England relied entirely on Harthacnut remaining across the sea. Everything Harold had constructed, fragile alliances, quiet obedience, the illusion of stability, existed only because the rightful heir was absent. The moment Harthacnut returned, the moral weight of Alfred's death, the questions of legitimacy, and the resentment of the kingdom would crash back with unstoppable force. Harold did not voice these fears publicly. There were no proclamations, no attempts to justify his rule. The king who remained unseen chose silence as his shield. Privately, however, he prepared for a future in which his crown might vanish overnight. Plans were made, contingencies considered, alliances reinforced. Every decision, every measured word, every action was shaped by the shadow of a return he could not prevent. It was kingship stripped of certainty, power divorced from permanence, a rule that existed on a delicate balance of absence, fear, and calculation. And in this quiet tension, every choice Harold made carried the weight of survival, fragile, invisible, and haunting. England looked serene, almost peaceful, but beneath the calm, memory lingered. Whispers of Alfred's death drifted through royal halls. The exile of Emma was quietly observed. Harold's absence of coronation, his silence in ceremonies, did not go unnoticed. These small fractures, these overlooked details, accumulated like shadows at dusk. Nothing erupted. No rebellion tore the kingdom apart. Yet nothing truly healed either. Pain, resentment, and questions of legitimacy remained, coiled beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to stir. History was recording it all not in grand proclamations, but in memory, in behavior, in hushed conversations and cautious glances. Every choice Harold made, every act of silence or restraint became part of a record far more enduring than stone or ink. And history remembers. When the moment came, when absence could no longer protect him, when the rightful heir returned, when the kingdom's patience thinned, those memories would rise, inexorable and unyielding. England may have appeared calm, its streets may have seemed orderly, but beneath the quiet the evidence waited, and when the time arrived it would not be ignored. If Harold possessed a skill above all others, it was endurance. He had navigated suspicion, illegitimacy, and the lingering shadows of bloodshed. He had maintained a fragile kingdom without admiration, without blessing, and without the fanfare that often legitimizes power. England functioned under his rule, yet his presence was felt more as an absence than a command, quiet, restrained, almost invisible. That alone made him extraordinary. To survive when every advantage seemed against him, to hold together a kingdom in the wake of Cnut's death, and amid the threats of Harthacnut's claim, required a patience and resilience few could comprehend. But survival is not the same as legacy. Endurance does not guarantee remembrance, nor does it secure a place in history beyond the whispers of those who observed it. And Harold, whether he fully understood it or not, was guiding a kingdom toward an ending he could not dictate. Every decision, every calculated silence, every alliance maintained was a delicate step toward a future where control might slip through his fingers entirely. Remarkable though he was, his story was defined not by triumph, but by the quiet tension of inevitability. By the late 1030s, whispers had grown heavier and rumors hardened into certainty. Harthacnut was coming. The news arrived slowly at first, like distant waves lapping at the edges of England. Then with increasing force, letters, messengers, murmurs in halls and marketplaces. The kingdom had not prepared itself for this inevitability. Emotionally, politically, even psychologically, England had grown accustomed to Harold's quiet presence. It had learned to survive under absence and subtlety. But absence cannot protect forever. The silence that once allowed Harold to rule unseen now shifted. It began to feel judgmental. Every unspoken doubt, every quiet resentment, every whispered memory of Alfred's death and of Emma's exile gathered weight. Harold's kingdom had been built in shadows, in patience, in restraint. And now, the shadows themselves seemed to lean forward, to witness, to weigh, and to judge. The invisible king, who had endured and maneuvered so carefully, now faced the most dangerous opponent of all. The return of the rightful heir and the quiet, inexorable verdict of history itself. England had learned to obey, but soon it would have to decide whom it would follow. Harald Harefoot still lived, still ruled, still waited. But the current of history had shifted, and the story was moving beyond him. What had once been his careful exercise of power, his patient endurance, his quiet management of a kingdom, was no longer enough to define his place in England. History had begun keeping score, not of his victories, not of his survival, but of his debts. Every compromise, every silent concession, every uncelebrated decision was being tallied in the invisible ledger of legitimacy. And England, which had endured under his shadowed reign, had become patient, watchful, and ready. The quiet obedience that had preserved his crown was fragile. The whispers in corridors, the cautious glances in council rooms, the memories of Alfred, Emma, and Cnut, all were waiting to converge. And when the moment arrived, when absence could no longer shield him, the kingdom would act. Not with spectacle, not with proclamation, but with the inexorable force of collective expectation. Harold had ruled in silence, but silence can be a double-edged sword. The kingdom that once allowed him to exist quietly was now preparing to remind him, and the world that no crown, however invisible, is immune to reckoning. There are moments in history when power does not collapse through rebellion or defeat, but through the slow failure of the body that carries it. By the late 1030s, those close to Harold noticed changes they did not speak about openly. He tired more easily. He withdrew for longer periods. Meetings were shortened, decisions delayed. Illness in medieval courts was dangerous even when minor. A coughing king invited speculation. A weakened ruler encouraged ambition. Harold understood this instinctively. He concealed his condition as best he could. Royal appearances became rarer but not absent. He showed himself just enough to remind England that he still lived, that he still ruled. But strength, once questioned, cannot be restored by appearances alone. Harold had ruled through silence and absence. Now, absence began to work against him. Those who had supported him for stability began to calculate alternatives. Those who had feared him began to imagine a future without him. The crown remained on his head, but it no longer felt secure. Courts are never silent, they only pretend to be. As Harold's health declined, whispers moved faster than official messages ever could. Nobles spoke in private. Clergy listened carefully. Messengers carried more than letters, they carried impressions. Is the king unwell? How long has he been unwell? What happens if he dies? No one asked these questions publicly, but everyone asked them privately. England had learned to function under uncertainty. Now it prepared to survive another one. Harold's allies reassured themselves that succession would be smooth. After all, Harthacnut still had not returned. Distance remained their greatest ally, but distance shrinks quickly when death approaches. Every rumor of illness made Harthacnut's name heavier. Every delay felt temporary. The kingdom that once drifted now leaned forward, anticipating impact. Harold remained at the center, aware, alert, but increasingly alone. Power had come to him quietly. It now prepared to leave him the same way. There is a moment in every precarious reign when a ruler faces an undeniable truth. No matter what he does next, the ending will not be his. For Harold, that moment came not with fanfare, nor in a roar of battle, but quietly, almost imperceptibly. He had survived longer than anyone anticipated. He had kept England from fracturing. He had weathered threats that might have destroyed a lesser king. Yet survival alone had not built permanence. He left behind no loyal dynasty to inherit his name, no ideology to justify his reign, no moral authority to command unquestioned obedience. What he possessed was fragile, borrowed time, stretched by caution, patience, and absence. Harold now ruled not as a man shaping the future, but as one delaying its arrival, buying moments that belonged to forces beyond his control. And in that quiet tension lies the cruelest truth. Delay is not mastery, endurance is not legitimacy, and even the most careful king cannot command fate. Harald Harefoot's reign is a study in subtle power, impressive in survival, yet haunted by the inevitability that no crown, however held, lasts forever. Across the sea, the balance of power finally began to shift. Harthacnut's rivals weakened. Denmark steadied under his rule. The wars and disputes that had kept him from England slowly faded into the past. For the first time since his father's death, the journey back across the North Sea no longer seemed impossible. Plans were quietly made. Ships were readied. Allies were discreetly contacted. Every move was deliberate, calculated, and patient. England, once complacent under Harold's shadowed rule, now waited with a growing awareness. Harold's supporters, whose loyalty had always been practical rather than heartfelt, felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. Practical loyalties, after all, are quick to bend, and the tides of fortune were beginning to turn. If Harthacnut returned strong, resistance would be meaningless. Worse still, anyone closely tied to Harold risked more than defeat, they risked ruin. Harold understood all of this. He did not panic. He did not strike rashly. He had spent years mastering the art of waiting, of surviving the currents of uncertainty. But understanding the end does not make it any less inevitable. And for Harald Harefoot, the end was drawing near, silent, relentless, and impossible to avoid. As Harold's grip weakened, England began a subtle, almost imperceptible ritual. It started to forget him. His name surfaced less in conversation. Decisions once traced to the king now flowed naturally through councils, courts, and local authorities. Authority diffused outward, preparing silently for the inevitable transition. This was not betrayal. It was instinct. It was survival. A kingdom shaped by decades of upheaval had learned how to detach emotionally from rulers whose reigns might not endure. England had become practiced in moving on, in preserving itself above loyalty to any single figure. Silence, absence, and observation had taught its people patience and pragmatism. Harold remained alive. He still wore the crown. His rule, though diminished, continued in form. Yet in the quiet motions of everyday life, he was already fading. Conversations carried his name less. Allegiances shifted subtly. The kingdom, without violence or proclamation, had begun to exist as if he were not there, preparing, unconsciously, for the next chapter. Harald Harefoot remained king, but the kingdom had already started to recede from him, and his presence, once central, was becoming a shadow. Power rarely concludes in a single instant. It does not vanish in a clash of swords or the fall of a crown. It drifts slowly, almost imperceptibly, until the world moves on without noticing. Harold still issued commands. He still wore the title of king. But the machinery of England no longer depended on him. Orders were relayed through intermediaries, decisions shaped by those who anticipated a future in which his presence would not matter. Authority had begun to escape him, quietly slipping through channels he no longer fully controlled. This was the true end of his reign, not a dramatic death on the battlefield, not a violent overthrow, but irrelevance. The king who had survived suspicion, illegitimacy, and decades of delicate balance was now a shadow of himself. The kingdom operated around him rather than because of him. And irrelevance is a far harsher sentence than defeat. A defeated king is remembered for his failure. An irrelevant one is remembered only in whispers, footnotes, and the empty spaces where power once resided. Harald Harefoot's reign did not end with a bang. It ended with silence, subtle, complete, and unyielding. Harold's final days passed almost without notice. There was no sudden illness chronicled, no dramatic confrontation, no sweeping declaration that would etch his name into history. No final command altered the course of England. The world moved quietly around him as it had throughout his reign. There was only weakness, only waiting, only the slow, inevitable decline of a presence that had once been felt, now fading into shadow. Each day passed with a muted weight, each hour stretching the interval between life and memory. In this, his ending reflected the nature of his rule. Quiet, calculated, uncelebrated. He had never sought grandeur nor inspired devotion. His authority had been subtle, his power endured through patience rather than triumph. Even in death, the subtlety persisted. England did not mourn loudly. The chronicles did not record fanfare. His passing was a whisper in the corridors of history, the final echo of a reign defined more by survival than by spectacle. Harald Harefoot's life and rule ended not with a roar, but in silence, a quiet testament to a king who existed in the shadows and departed into them as well. When Harald Harefoot passed in 1040, England remained calm. There was no eruption of grief, no dramatic upheaval, no desperate defense of a fading king. The streets did not swell with mourners, and the halls of power did not tremble in chaos. There was no grand funeral, no ceremonious display of loyalty, no hasty proclamations to secure his memory. History barely paused. Instead, the kingdom moved, slowly, deliberately, naturally. Decisions continued, councils met, laws were enforced. Life carried on as it always had. This was not indifference. It was the result of decades of quiet preparation. England had long learned to endure uncertainty, to adapt to rulers whose reigns might not last. Harold's subtle, shadowed authority had given the kingdom time to adjust, to detach, to survive without relying entirely on a single figure. And now, the moment the kingdom had been waiting for arrived. The king was gone, but the world he had ruled continued without him. Movement replaced presence, and survival replaced allegiance. Harald Harefoot died quietly, but England, ever patient, had been ready. With Harold gone, the stillness settled once more over England. But this silence was different. It no longer protected a king. It no longer concealed uncertainty. Now it waited, patient, expectant, almost hungry, for someone else to step into its shadow. Across the North Sea, Harthacnut was no longer distant. The wars and obstacles that had kept him away had faded, leaving a clear path to the throne that Harold had once occupied in quiet tension. Every rumor, every report of ships readying, every whispered conversation in England's halls confirmed it. The reckoning was imminent. The kingdom had learned the lessons of absence and survival. It knew patience, it knew observation, and now it knew the moment had come for judgment. The silent king was gone, and in his place waited the rightful heir, the inevitable force that would test loyalty, strength, and the fragile order Harold had maintained. England, patient and deliberate, held its breath, and the reckoning, long postponed by absence and strategy, was ready to begin. Harald Harefoot's reign began quietly, and it ended the same way, without ceremony, without fanfare, without the spectacle that often marks the passing of kings. Yet history did not allow him to vanish entirely. The silence that had protected him in life could not shield him from the reckoning that followed. England, patient and deliberate, remembered. Every whisper of Alfred's death, every subtle resentment, every carefully observed slight accumulated into a ledger of judgment far more enduring than any crown. What came next would ensure that the kingdom never forgot the weight and cost of his rule. Not through open rebellion, nor through violent uprising, but through memory, reflection, and the quiet recalibration of loyalty. The lessons of his subtle authority, the ways in which absence, patience, and silence had maintained order would be measured, weighed, and when the time came, answered. And that judgment, when it arrived, would be unflinching. It would not be tempered by mercy or softened by respect for survival. It would be thorough, exacting, and brutal, the inevitable consequence of a reign conducted in shadow, yet never beyond the scrutiny of history. Harthacnut did not cross the North Sea as a hopeful heir. He came as a judge. Years of waiting had forged him into a man of purpose and precision. War had sharpened his instincts, honed his strategies, and hardened his resolve. The memory of his brother Alfred, blinded, broken, dead, had followed him across every mile of sea and land, a shadow that demanded reckoning. England received him not with defiance but with quiet acquiescence. No army rose to defend Harold's memory. No council delayed the inevitable transfer of power. The throne, once held in silence and subtlety, now shifted through the unstoppable force of inevitability. This was not reconciliation. It was correction. Harthacnut stepped into a kingdom that had already prepared for him. Officials swore loyalty swiftly. Nobles emphasized their distance from Harold's decisions. Citizens adapted silently, understanding the demands of the moment. England was no longer choosing sides. It was erasing a chapter it had endured, removing the shadow of a reign that had held authority without legitimacy. Every gesture, every oath, every quiet observation marked the restoration of order, deliberate, unyielding, and absolute. Harthacnut did not speak of vengeance at first, and that restraint terrified more than open fury ever could. He listened, he observed, he let stories rise from the shadows, he allowed silence itself to compel confessions. Slowly, painstakingly, the truth of Alfred's death surfaced, fragmented, incomplete, yet undeniable. Responsibility shifted from one person to the next, each attempting to distance themselves from the guilt, to place the blame a step farther away. But Harthacnut was not seeking excuses. He was seeking acknowledgement. England had allowed Alfred to die. Harold had ruled in that silence. And that quiet, that patience, that avoidance had shielded them all from accountability. Now, that silence would be answered. Every whispered justification, every evasive glance, every subtle act of complicity was under scrutiny. Harthacnut's purpose was clear, not to mete out revenge in haste, but to ensure that the kingdom recognized its part in the injustice. The invisible chains of fear, obedience, and avoidance that had protected the guilty would be broken, not violently, perhaps, but inevitably. England had once ruled quietly in the shadows. Now the shadows would reveal truth, and truth demanded reckoning. Harthacnut could not punish Harold while he lived, so he struck at Harold as a symbol. In a decision that shocked even medieval England, Harthacnut ordered his half-brother's body exhumed. The grave was opened. The corpse was dragged into the open. The head was severed. What remained was discarded into a distant marsh, denied consecrated ground, denied dignity, denied remembrance. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was deliberate political theater. In medieval belief, the treatment of a body carried meaning beyond the flesh. Burial conferred divine judgment. Desecration declared that a life and reign had been illegitimate, retroactively, absolutely, and eternally. By violating Harold even in death, Harthacnut sent a message that no crown obtained through silence and absence would be honored by history. This was more than revenge for Alfred. It was a rewriting of memory, a deliberate reshaping of the past, a lesson for all who came after. Power obtained in shadows without legitimacy could be erased, denied, and condemned forever. Harthacnut did not merely punish a man. He punished a legacy. Please repolish this narration. 185. It must not have been used before or violate YouTube policy guideline and reuse content and storytelling history. You make cinematic, fresh, suspense and emotional storyline. England did not rise against the desecration. And that silence carried weight. No noble voiced objection. No bishop intervened. No rebellion coalesced in Harold's defense. The kingdom watched quietly, aware of what this act symbolized. Harold had never been fully embraced. His reign was tolerated, not celebrated. His authority endured, but legitimacy had always been conditional, fragile, dependent on absence, patience, and the kingdom's quiet acquiescence. When the reckoning arrived, England did not resist. It stepped aside. The punishment was brutal, undeniable, and final, yet beneath the shock lay a sense of resolution. The moral tension that had lingered since Alfred's death, the unease, the whispered doubts, the lingering questions of justice, was addressed, if not with mercy, then with clarity. England had finally reconciled the shadow of Harold's rule. In the silence that followed, the kingdom acknowledged a hard truth. Power obtained without consent, maintained through absence and tolerated authority, could survive only until history demanded its reckoning. The kingdom did not celebrate. It did not mourn, it understood. Harold's end was harsh, but in that harshness the kingdom found closure. With Harold erased, England could feign innocence. The kingdom condensed blame into a single figure. Responsibility, once dispersed among nobles, officials, and the crown itself, was narrowed, focused, and simplified. History, ever eager for clarity, reshaped itself around this convenient truth. This is how nations endure uncomfortable realities. They assign one person the weight of many decisions, the consequences of choices made in shadows, and the unspoken guilt that comes from survival. In doing so, the collective conscience of a realm is spared, its memory sanitized, its moral tension resolved. Harald Harefoot became that vessel. His name, his body, his reign, all concentrated the judgment that might have been diffused across a kingdom. He absorbed the moral reckoning that England itself could not confront, and once the weight had been placed upon him, the kingdom exhaled. Life continued. Laws were enforced. Nobles reasserted influence. Citizens adapted as they always had. The machinery of governance moved forward, deliberate, silent, unyielding. Harold's erasure allowed England to move on. His story lingered only in whispers, footnotes, and shadows, a reminder that survival and culpability often travel separate paths. Harthacnut now ruled fully, visibly, without question, but his authority was not built on reconciliation. It began with reckoning, with judgment, not restoration. The scars of Harold's reign ran deep. Trust had been fractured. Blood had been shed. Silence, once a tool of subtle control, had become a weapon, leaving hidden wounds that no ceremony or proclamation could easily heal. The kingdom had endured, but it had endured cautiously, warily, its patience tested by years of absence and shadowed authority. Harthacnut inherited more than a throne. He inherited the unresolved tensions of a kingdom that had learned to survive uncertainty, that had tolerated rulership without legitimacy, and that now demanded acknowledgement, accountability, and closure. Every council meeting, every oath of loyalty, every cautious glance reflected the weight of past betrayals and lingering doubt. His reign was not merely the continuation of rule. It was a confrontation with memory, with consequences, with the echoes of silence that had protected Harold yet constrained England itself. Harthacnut's task was not to celebrate power, but to confront the aftermath, to govern a kingdom shaped as much by unresolved wounds as by loyalty. Harald Harefoot vanished swiftly from memory. Chronicles condensed his years on the throne into brief passages. Tales of his rule were simplified, diminished, overshadowed by the deeds of stronger, more celebrated kings. His name slipped quietly from the stories told in halls, from the lessons passed through generations, and from the collective memory of the kingdom he once ruled. This was no accident. It was deliberate. History, like a sculptor, chooses which figures to elevate and which to obscure. It preserves those whose reigns inspire admiration or fear, whose deeds can be told in heroic arcs, and it quietly erases those whose authority exposed its fragility, whose presence revealed how survival could persist without legitimacy, and whose reigns were maintained more by patience than by power. Harold's subtle, shadowed rule highlighted a weakness in the kingdom's narrative. That power could endure without love, without ceremony, without moral approval, and such truths are rarely celebrated. So he faded, not through violence, not through scandal, but through deliberate omission. Harald Harefoot disappeared from memory, a king erased, not by conquest but by the quiet authority of history itself. Harold's reign revealed a truth England had long avoided. Power could endure without legitimacy. Authority could persist without consent. Silence could crown a king where ceremony, loyalty, or moral approval had failed. These were uncomfortable lessons, ones that unsettled the very foundations of a kingdom built on recognition, oaths, and visible rule. His subtle mastery made him dangerous, not merely in life, but in memory. To remember Harold honestly was to confront the fragility of governance itself. The notion that order could exist without justice, that stability could be maintained by patience and absence rather than trust or devotion. Historians, chroniclers, and storytellers all instinctively softened his legacy, diminished his role, and shifted focus to rulers whose authority aligned more comfortably with tradition and narrative. Yet the danger persisted in the shadows. His reign served as a quiet warning. Kingdoms are vulnerable to those who wield power through patience, discretion, and endurance. Even erased from the page, Harold's rule whispered a lesson to all who would follow, that legitimacy is not the sole measure of authority, and that the absence of spectacle does not diminish the weight of power. History did not forgive Harold, nor did it fully condemn him. It simply moved on silently, methodically, without ceremony or acknowledgement. His reign, once real and consequential, was compressed into footnotes, overshadowed by kings who followed, and obscured by the narratives that preferred clarity over nuance. The lessons of his subtle rule, the fragile authority he maintained, the patience and endurance that had kept a kingdom intact, were quietly erased. In that forgetting, something vital was lost. The kingdom and later historians overlooked the uncomfortable truths Harold embodied. That power could exist without overt legitimacy, that silence and absence could sustain rule, that a crown could survive on endurance rather than adulation. These were truths that unsettled, that challenged the assumptions upon which dynasties and chronicles were built. To forget Harold was to lose sight of how kingdoms survive in shadows, how authority can persist quietly, and how history itself can obscure the lessons embedded in subtlety. He was neither hero nor villain, neither celebrated nor reviled. He was a reminder that history is selective, that memory is fragile, and that the absence of spectacle does not diminish the weight of a reign once lived. Harald Harefoot matters not because he was celebrated, mighty, or revered, but because he was possible. He ruled not through conquest or overwhelming force, but through absence, patience, and circumstance. Not through legitimacy or unquestioned consent, but through convenience, opportunity, and the fragile acquiescence of a kingdom unprepared to resist. Not through love, loyalty, or admiration, but through the quiet authority that fear, uncertainty, and endurance can command. His reign exposes a subtle truth. That power does not always belong to the strongest, the most beloved, or the most legitimate. Sometimes it belongs to the one who is present when uncertainty arrives, the one who navigates absence, and the one who survives long enough to claim what others hesitate to secure. Harold's story reminds us that history is not composed solely of heroes or villains, triumphs or tragedies. It is also shaped by the small, quiet moments when no one intervenes, when circumstances conspire, and when authority passes through silence rather than spectacle. And those moments have not disappeared. They exist still in kingdoms, corporations, and communities, wherever opportunity meets inaction and history bends not to greatness, but to possibility. England moved quickly after Harold's death. The machinery of the kingdom continued, almost as if Harold had never ruled. Laws were enforced, taxes collected, courts functioned. The river of daily life carried on, indifferent to who sat on the throne. Yet, beneath the surface, the memory of his reign lingered. Every noble who had tolerated him in silence now understood the cost of compliance. Every act of obedience had left a shadow. Fear had kept order, but it had also taught caution, calculation, and patience. Harthacnut stepped into this kingdom with more than authority. He inherited an atmosphere, a collective understanding that power, when unearned or ill-gained, leaves stains that do not fade with time. Harold was gone, but his story had already shaped England. Harold's reign was brief, only 5 years, but it left a lesson. Fear can maintain a crown, but it cannot inspire loyalty. England obeyed, but it did not trust. Officials complied, but they planned contingencies. Nobles survived, but they remembered. In subtle ways, fear shapes behavior more than any law. It forces decisions, limits ambition, and dictates alliances. But it also generates unease, doubt, and quiet rebellion in hearts that remain outwardly loyal. Harold had ruled through this invisible force. He had stabilized a kingdom not by strength or legitimacy, but by circumstance, presence, and subtle control. And while it had worked for a time, the cost was clear. Authority based on fear leaves only temporary structures. Once the central figure is removed, the cracks widen quickly. This is the invisible tragedy of Harold's reign. It teaches the durability of silence, but also its fragility. Harald Harefoot's story mirrors another tragic English king, Edward the Martyr, who had also ruled young, surrounded by uncertainty, and cut down before he could consolidate power. Both faced fragile loyalties, invisible threats, and nobles ready to act quietly for their own survival. Both demonstrated that the crown is never safe simply because bloodline dictates it. Authority in medieval England relied on recognition, and without it, the throne became a stage for risk, calculation, and often violence. But the contrast is stark. Edward's death is remembered with moral weight, a martyr for justice. Harold's is remembered more quietly, almost as a cautionary tale of convenience and survival. In these stories, we see a truth about history. It remembers unevenly. The king who dies nobly is immortalized. The king who survives but rules through absence or fear risks being forgotten, judged, or erased entirely. Harold's reign may appear minor, but its significance lies in the subtleties, in the lessons it leaves about power, morality, and the quiet forces that govern human behavior. Harold's greatest tool was absence. He ruled not by force alone, nor by ceremony, nor by charisma. He ruled because he was present when others were not. He maintained authority quietly, letting uncertainty and hesitation do his work for him. In a sense, absence was a weapon more subtle than a sword. It allowed him to observe, adapt, and manipulate circumstance without confrontation. Yet it also concealed vulnerability, because ruling by quiet presence does not create allegiance. It only manages it temporarily. England obeyed Harold, but it did not love him. His reign was like a tide held at bay by a dam, stable, yet always under pressure. The moment the dam weakens, the waters rush. And history shows that no dam built on convenience and fear can last forever. Silence had protected Harold during his reign. It allowed him to navigate succession disputes, control nobles, and keep England calm. But silence is fragile. It must be maintained through careful observation, subtle threats, and constant awareness of shifting loyalties. Harold's silence could not defend him from illness, nor from the inevitability of Harthacnut's return, nor could it protect his memory from the judgment that followed his death. Yet it shaped England profoundly. Decisions made quietly, fears unspoken, and obedience without enthusiasm altered the kingdom's rhythm. Nobles became cautious, alliances fragile, and trust conditional. History often overlooks such reigns. They lack battles, crowns, and glory. But they reveal deeper truths about human behavior, how fear and uncertainty govern more than force, and how absence and restraint can wield power as effectively as armies. Harold's story teaches that survival alone does not guarantee respect, loyalty, or lasting authority. Even after his body was desecrated, Harold's reign left traces. Chroniclers debated him. Nobles recalled decisions they had followed reluctantly. The memory of Alfred's death and the fear that had sustained Harold lingered in political calculations for decades. Memory, in history, can be as powerful as action. What Harold built through quiet authority remained influential, not because it was admired, but because it was remembered, and remembered with caution. Kings and rulers who came after would study these lessons, knowingly or unknowingly, learning how fear can enforce obedience and how absence can be as potent as presence. Harald Harefoot, the king who ruled quietly, who survived chaos, who navigated fear and legitimacy, had disappeared physically. But his story continued not in glory but in the subtle shaping of English power. Harald Harefoot's reign was brief, but it left lessons England could not ignore. Fear could hold a kingdom together, but only temporarily. Silence could crown a king, but only as long as memory remained dormant. Legitimacy, once questioned, could never fully recover. Nobles learned to navigate uncertainty carefully. They observed, waited, and acted only when the path was clear. They understood that survival sometimes mattered more than loyalty, and compliance more than justice. Harold had ruled quietly, deliberately, and without ceremony, a king defined by what he avoided rather than what he created. In doing so, he exposed the fragile mechanics of authority. England had functioned under his rule, but it had never embraced it. Obedience had replaced respect. Fear had replaced trust. And yet, these invisible forces shaped behavior more profoundly than any battle, law, or edict ever could. Harold may have been forgotten in chronicles, but the way England acted, the way it remembered, or chose not to, carried the imprint of his reign for decades. A throne without trust is always fragile. Harold ruled England not through consensus, but through circumstance. He survived because no one dared challenge him, because the rightful heir was far away, and because silence protected him. But this throne was never secure in the moral sense. Authority granted without consent leaves an invisible debt, a tension that history always remembers. England continued under Harold, but the kingdom's loyalty was never fully earned. Every decision he made, every law enforced, every noble rewarded or ignored, existed under the quiet threat that the next king could undo it all. Power built on fear is temporary. Influence gained through absence is precarious. The moment a ruler like Harold leaves the stage, whether through death, exile, or defeat, the kingdom breathes, evaluates, and adjusts. Harold's reign demonstrates that survival alone is not greatness. A king may outlast battles, threats, and rivals, but if trust and legitimacy are missing, even the quietest crown carries the weight of inevitable judgment. Memory is a quiet, relentless judge. Harold's absence from official ceremonies, his reliance on fear and caution, and the tragic death of Alfred Etheling ensured that his story lingered. England remembered not in celebration, but in caution. Nobles spoke softly of his decisions, chroniclers recorded events with careful phrasing, and future rulers absorbed the lessons without acknowledging their source. Harold's reign was a mirror. It showed what could happen when legitimacy is bypassed, when power is held through convenience rather than consent. His story became a quiet warning, embedded in the culture of decision-making, the rituals of allegiance, and the subtle art of survival. Kings who came later would navigate England's political landscape with awareness of these invisible rules, fear and silence as much a tool as armies or laws. Harold had taught them this lesson, unintentionally, by ruling in the shadows rather than in the spotlight. Harold's influence endured silently. He left no grand monuments, no celebrated victories, no public reforms, yet his reign altered the behavior of those who survived him. Nobles became cautious, officials became methodical, and the kingdom adapted to the subtle logic of fear and survival. This is the paradox of his rule. The quieter he was, the louder the lessons he imparted. A king can shape history without banners or armies if he manipulates absence, observation, and the latent tension of power. Harold had done this perfectly. England functioned. Life went on. And yet the memory of what was required to maintain that order, the silences, the deaths, the moral compromises left an imprint that outlasted him. In a way, Harold ruled beyond death. Not through celebration, not through loyalty, but through the invisible shaping of thought, action, and cautious obedience. Absence was Harold's most potent tool and his most revealing flaw. By not asserting himself openly, by avoiding ceremonies and confrontation, he survived threats that would have destroyed a more ambitious king. But absence also concealed weakness, and ultimately, it could not defend against the inevitability of Harthacnut's return or the moral reckoning that followed Alfred Etheling's death. Power maintained through absence is always conditional. It works until someone stronger, faster, or more decisive arrives. History often judges such kings harshly, not always for what they did, but for what they allowed to happen while waiting. Harold's quiet reign shows us that influence without legitimacy is temporary, obedience without loyalty is fragile, and silence can both crown and condemn a ruler. England obeyed, but it never forgave. By the end of Harold's life, England had transformed subtly, invisibly, but irreversibly. The kingdom learned caution, nobles learned observation, officials learned calculation. Ordinary people learned to adapt to rulers whose authority was uncertain. Harold's reign became a lesson in the mechanics of power, how fear governs as effectively as law, how silence can enforce obedience, and how absence can become authority. He may not have been remembered fondly, but he was remembered, and memory is the currency of influence. The kingdom's behavior during and after Harold's reign demonstrates that history is shaped not only by actions, but by the psychological imprint left on those who survive them. Fear, survival, and cautious observation became part of England's political DNA, all because of a king who ruled quietly, feared little, and avoided attention, until the moment when death and justice arrived together. Even decades later, Alfred Etheling's death echoed in political memory. His tragedy became a silent warning. Legitimacy ignored can return as reckoning. The nobility, the clergy, and even future monarchs understood the cost of political convenience. Harold may have survived and ruled, but his methods created lessons no one would forget. England remembered what silence can hide and what obedience can demand. This is the subtle, cinematic tragedy of his reign. Power maintained, life preserved. Yet history judges him not by victories, but by absence, fear, and the irreversible consequences of small acts of violence. Harald Harefoot's legacy is quiet, almost invisible. He left no battles to celebrate, no reforms to remember, no songs to sing. Yet his reign reshaped behavior, thought, and expectation. England had survived, it had obeyed, it had endured, but it had also learned the subtle lessons of fear, of absence, of silence. These lessons persisted, forming the undercurrent of political behavior long after the crown passed to Harthacnut. Sometimes the most enduring rulers are those whose reigns are remembered not for grandeur, but for the invisible imprint they leave on minds, institutions, and culture. Harald Harefoot is such a ruler. Harold ruled without recognition, without blessing, without love. And yet, in ruling this way, he demonstrated something crucial. That kingship is not always about triumph or ceremony. Sometimes it is about survival, subtle influence, and the quiet shaping of a kingdom's behavior. England remembered him not in glory, but in its caution. Fear and obedience replaced celebration. Silence replaced loyalty. And for centuries, his story would stand as a reminder. Authority granted through convenience is fragile, compliance through fear is temporary, and absence can be both crown and curse. Harald Harefoot was not a king to be cheered or mourned. He was a king to be studied quietly, for what his reign reveals about power, morality, and human behavior. His legacy is unseen, but it is there, woven into the choices of those who survived him, and the lessons passed to generations who learned, quietly, the cost of allowing fear to govern. Harthacnut's arrival marked the end of uncertainty. England had endured years of quiet fear under Harold, and now it looked toward a ruler who could restore both legitimacy and visibility. Every noble, every official, every observer understood that the balance of power had shifted. The throne, once fragile, would now be reinforced, but at a cost. Harthacnut did not rush to forgive. He ruled with calculated patience, asserting authority through presence, ceremony, and decisive action. He reminded the kingdom that the crown was not a tool of fear, but a symbol of power, order, and consequence. Yet even as he consolidated power, the shadow of Harold lingered. The lessons of fear and silence had become embedded in England's political DNA. Nobles moved cautiously, clergy observed carefully, and ordinary people learned the rhythms of survival in a world where the crown's authority could be wielded quietly or violently. Harthacnut restored order, but the echoes of Harold's reign were not erased. They persisted, subtle, invisible, shaping behavior, alliances, and memory. Harold's reign had been brief, but its consequences were profound. Every act of avoidance, every decision made quietly, every life disrupted, left traces that Harthacnut now inherited. The kingdom functioned, yes, but beneath the surface, caution had become instinct. Nobles who had once tolerated silence now understood that power demands visibility. The absence of legitimacy is never without cost. Harthacnut's challenge was not simply to rule, it was to reshape behavior, to restore faith, and to ensure that obedience was rooted in respect rather than fear. Harald had survived through absence. Harthacnut would rule through presence. In this transition, we see a truth about history. One ruler's caution can teach lessons far beyond their own reign. Harald may have been forgotten in chronicles, but his influence lingered quietly in every cautious glance, every whispered warning, every decision measured against unseen danger. History is rarely fair. Harald's body was desecrated, his reign minimized, and yet he left an invisible mark. Memory, even when suppressed, shapes the future. England learned to anticipate the consequences of silence and fear. Decisions were measured more carefully, alliances questioned more deliberately, and obedience became a blend of respect and caution. Harthacnut ruled over a kingdom that remembered what had been tolerated. His authority, visible and ceremonial, contrasted with Harold's quiet rule, but it relied on the very lessons Harold had imparted unintentionally. This is the subtle tragedy of power. Those who survive through fear leave a legacy not of admiration, but of learning lessons in vigilance, caution, and the cost of unchallenged authority. Harold's story persisted, quietly shaping decisions, behavior, and memory, even as he was erased from chronicles. Harthacnut's rule brought legitimacy back into focus. Where Harold had relied on absence, Harthacnut relied on visibility. Every ceremony, every oath, every public appearance reinforced the idea that the crown was sanctioned by the church, by nobles, and by God. England responded. Fear, once the primary instrument of order, gave way to respect, cautious, measured, but genuine. The kingdom began to heal slowly from the psychological imprint Harold had left. Nobles recalibrated their alliances. Officials moved with more clarity. Ordinary people regained the sense that the crown represented stability rather than uncertainty. Yet even as legitimacy returned, the memory of what had been tolerated lingered. Decisions were weighed with caution. Silence was still a tool. Fear was still remembered. Harold had ruled quietly, survived danger, and left England obedient. Harthacnut ruled openly, reinforced authority, and reminded the kingdom of accountability. Together, their stories reveal the delicate balance between survival, legitimacy, and influence. Harold's reign reminds us that silence has a price. By avoiding confrontation, avoiding ceremony, and ruling through subtle fear, he survived. But his methods carried costs, moral, political, and psychological. England functioned, yes, but trust was eroded. Nobles obeyed, but they did not believe. Authority was recognized, but not respected. Harthacnut inherited more than a throne. He inherited lessons learned the hard way. Every cautious glance, every private consultation, every whispered warning was a product of Harold's rule. Silence and fear became embedded in the way England operated, shaping behavior long after Harold was gone. History rarely notes these subtleties. It remembers battles, coronations, and triumphs. But the invisible lessons of fear, absence, and survival shape kingdoms far longer than victory ever could. Harold's legacy is not in glory, but in the quiet ways a kingdom adjusts, adapts, and remembers. Harold's reign also teaches a broader lesson about power. Authority without trust is inherently fragile. Fear can enforce obedience, absence can maintain control, and silence can prevent rebellion, but only for a time. The moment circumstances change, a rival returns, an heir comes of age, or illness strikes, the structure built on these principles collapses. Harthacnut's consolidation demonstrates this. England obeyed Harold quietly, but it obeyed Harthacnut openly. The crown regained legitimacy, rituals, and moral authority, the very things Harold's reign had lacked. Yet the invisible lessons remained. Nobles acted more cautiously, alliances were approached with care, and England had learned that survival and obedience could coexist with fear. Harold's influence lingered in the behaviors he forced upon the kingdom, even as Harthacnut reshaped the narrative. Harold's legacy is subtle, almost invisible. He left no celebrated victories, no monuments, no songs. Yet the kingdom's memory of his reign shaped behavior, decisions, and political culture for decades. The nobility learned caution. Officials practiced careful observation. Ordinary people understood the rhythms of survival under a ruler whose authority was uncertain. This quiet imprint is perhaps more lasting than any crown, army, or law. History may have minimized Harold's reign, but England itself remembered. Every act of caution, every whisper, every measured alliance was shaped by the reign of a king who ruled without attention, yet left a mark deeper than most rulers achieve in centuries. Harold's reign reminds us that authority is more than titles and crowns. A king may survive through silence, absence, or fear, but survival alone does not create respect, loyalty, or moral authority. England obeyed Harold, but it did not trust him. Obedience can be earned through fear, but it is fragile. Harthacnut's return and consolidation underscore the contrast. Legitimacy, presence, and moral authority can restore order more effectively than fear. Yet even in this restoration, the lessons of Harold's reign endured. In the end, Harold ruled quietly, survived danger, and shaped behavior invisibly. His reign is a study in the subtleties of power, the fragility of authority, and the long shadow left by absence and fear. Harald Harefoot may not appear in songs or grand chronicles. He left no monuments, no celebrated victories, no triumphant legacy. Yet his reign shaped England in ways that are invisible but undeniable. Silence, absence, and fear became tools of authority, and lessons embedded in political behavior for decades. Kings who followed learned from him, consciously or unconsciously. Nobles, officials, and ordinary people adapted to the realities he forced upon them. Authority was tested, obedience measured, and trust weighed carefully. Harold's story endures not in glory, but in the psychological imprint of a kingdom that survived him. He is the king you do not see, but whose influence lingers. His reign reminds us that power is more than crowns and ceremonies. It is behavior, memory, and consequence. And sometimes, the quietest kings leave the loudest lessons. After the storm of Harold's reign and the reckoning that followed, England settled into a fragile calm. Harthacnut's presence brought certainty where silence had reigned. Nobles who had operated cautiously under fear now understood the rules. Authority would be visible, consistent, and absolute. Order returned, but it was tempered by the lessons of the past. Harold's reign had left England cautious. Decisions were measured, alliances scrutinized, and trust given sparingly. Every official, noble, and observer understood that the crown's power was both real and conditional. Fear had maintained obedience, legitimacy restored loyalty. The balance was delicate. Yet beneath this calm, the memory of absence, silence, and quiet influence lingered. England had been shaped by a king who ruled invisibly, who survived through subtlety and fear, and whose legacy continued long after his death. The calm was not innocence. It was vigilance. A kingdom had learned that power is fragile, obedience is conditional, and history is written not only by victories, but by quiet lessons in survival. Harold's reign left a psychological mark on England. The kingdom had survived uncertainty, fear, and moral ambiguity. Nobles had learned to navigate the invisible rules of obedience and caution. Officials had discovered the weight of silence, how absence and restraint could enforce compliance more effectively than force. Even ordinary citizens felt it, though they did not name it. Life had continued under a king who rarely asserted himself directly, yet whose presence was always felt in subtle ways. Every delay, every quiet decision, every unspoken threat had shaped behavior. This is the invisible power of a ruler. You may not see the battles or hear the triumphs, but the echoes of influence ripple through society long after the crown has changed hands. Harold's reign demonstrates that authority is not merely performed publicly. It is enforced, learned, and internalized, in ways often unnoticed until the next ruler tests the balance. Harthacnut understood the lessons Harold had unintentionally left behind. He did not rule through fear. He did not hide in silence. Instead, he emphasized legitimacy, visibility, and decisiveness. Every oath sworn, every ceremony performed, every decree issued reinforced the crown's moral authority. But he was not blind to the lingering effects of Harold's reign. Nobles were cautious, alliances fragile, and obedience conditional. He navigated these dynamics carefully, reinforcing loyalty while respecting the lessons of past caution. Harold's subtle legacy was still present, shaping decisions and behavior. Harthacnut had to reconcile the kingdom's memory with the necessity of restoring order. Every choice reflected the dual awareness of past fear and present authority. Through this, we see how rulers inherit not just crowns, but also lessons, often invisible, often psychological, that shape the future of governance. Harold's quiet influence continued to mold England even as Harthacnut's presence commanded it. England had learned to survive under a king like Harold. Obedience had been enforced without visible authority. Fear had maintained order. Silence had been a tool more powerful than armies. And yet, this survival came at a cost. Trust eroded, alliances fragile, decisions cautious. Under Harthacnut, the kingdom learned a new balance. Authority was now visible and moral, but the lessons of absence and fear were embedded in every choice. Nobles weighed their loyalty carefully. Officials acted with deliberate observation. Ordinary people followed the rhythms of survival, mindful of the invisible forces that once shaped their lives. Harold's influence, though subtle, had endured. The kingdom had internalized his reign, the power of quiet, the danger of absence, and the fragility of obedience. These lessons would guide England long after Harthacnut's consolidation, quietly shaping behavior, strategy, and decision-making. Even as England healed, Harold's shadow remained. He had ruled quietly, surviving threats that might have toppled more aggressive kings. He had maintained order through absence, fear, and subtle manipulation. Though erased from chronicles and physically desecrated, his reign left psychological traces, lessons that nobles and officials could not ignore. Harthacnut faced the challenge of consolidating authority in a kingdom conditioned to fear the unseen. Every cautious glance, every measured word, every whispered warning reflected the invisible legacy Harold had left behind. History rarely celebrates such reigns. There are no songs, no monuments, no tales of triumph. Yet the invisible imprint they leave can shape kingdoms more profoundly than battlefield victories. Harold's influence persisted, not through ceremony, but through behavior, memory, and the subtle mechanics of obedience. This is the paradox of power. The quietest kings may leave the loudest lessons, and the most invisible reigns can cast the longest shadows. Harold's reign contrasts sharply with Harthacnut's consolidation. Harold survived, but he never achieved legitimacy. He ruled through silence, absence, and fear, a fragile combination. Harthacnut ruled through presence, ceremony, and moral authority, restoring legitimacy to the crown. Yet Harold's influence endured. The kingdom had learned to survive under his reign, to obey quietly, and to navigate the precarious balance of power. Fear had enforced order, absence had concealed weakness, and silence had maintained control. Harthacnut's challenge was to consolidate power without repeating the mistakes of the past. He needed to convert obedience into loyalty, fear into respect, and absence into visible authority. Harold's quiet reign had left the blueprint, unintentionally, invisibly, and persistently. This is the delicate dance of history. Survival teaches lessons, and even forgotten kings continue to shape the future through the behavior they imposed upon those who outlive them. England, now under Harthacnut, began to reflect on the lessons of Harold's reign. Every cautious decision, every hesitant alliance, every whispered warning was a trace of the past. The kingdom understood that obedience maintained order, but legitimacy secured loyalty. Fear could enforce compliance, but it could not create respect. Silence could conceal weakness, but it could not shield against judgment. Harold's reign had been quiet, almost invisible, yet its psychological impact shaped behavior, strategy, and policy long after his death. Kings who followed would learn from his mistakes and from his successes in ways both subtle and profound. This reflection is the mark of a kingdom that has endured. Survival, observation, and careful action become ingrained, not only in laws, but in the culture and memory of a nation. Harold's reign was short, but it resonated deeply, teaching lessons that could not be erased. Harald Harefoot ruled quietly, survived danger, and left England cautious. He did not conquer armies or build monuments. He did not inspire love or adoration. Yet he taught silently, invisibly, through the behavior he enforced and the lessons of fear, absence, and survival. His reign demonstrates that authority is not only performed publicly, it is absorbed, internalized, and remembered. Every cautious glance, every whispered word, every carefully measured action reflects the imprint of a king who ruled subtly but profoundly. In this way, Harold's influence endured beyond his death. England learned to navigate the precarious balance of obedience and loyalty, legitimacy and fear. The quietest rulers can leave the loudest lessons. The unseen king can shape history more than the celebrated. Even decades later, Harold's reign cast a shadow. Kings who followed, nobles who survived, and officials who remembered operated with caution born of his subtle influence. Fear, absence, and silence had enforced obedience, and their lessons persisted. Authority had returned under Harthacnut, but the kingdom's psyche remained shaped by Harold's reign. He is the invisible king, erased from glory, erased from memory in chronicles, yet present in the behavior, strategy, and decisions of those who followed. His reign is a study in the mechanics of power, the fragility of obedience, and the enduring consequences of quiet influence. Harald Harefoot's story is not dramatic. It is subtle, psychological, and profound. It reminds us that history is not only written in battles and coronations, but in the invisible forces of fear, survival, and adaptation. Sometimes the quietest kings leave the longest shadows, shaping kingdoms long after their names have faded. Silence had been Harold's greatest weapon, and his kingdom's heaviest burden. For 5 years, England obeyed without question, not because of loyalty, but because of fear and uncertainty. The nobility moved cautiously, the clergy whispered quietly, and the common people lived under the subtle pressure of authority without consent. Harold had ruled without ceremony, yet his influence pervaded every decision, every glance, every hesitation. When Harthacnut arrived, legitimacy returned, but the lessons of silence remained. England had learned that survival often depends on compliance, not conviction, on caution, not trust. Even in peace, the echoes of Harold's quiet reign shaped the kingdom's psyche, influencing decisions, alliances, and moral choices for decades. In this, Harold's reign becomes a study in power beyond crowns and armies. Sometimes the most profound influence is invisible. Sometimes the quietest ruler teaches the loudest lessons through absence, fear, and the moral compromises of those left to survive. Memory is the invisible ruler of a kingdom. Harold's reign, though brief and uncelebrated, became embedded in England's collective consciousness. Nobles recalled the subtle threats, the silences, and the fragile balance of obedience. Officials remembered that absence could govern as effectively as a decree, and fear could command as surely as armies. This invisible memory shaped the kingdom long after Harold's body was desecrated, and his name minimized in chronicles. England learned to anticipate consequences, weigh loyalty carefully, and act with subtle calculation. Decisions were no longer just about law or duty. They were about survival, perception, and the shadows of past authority. Harold had taught a lesson few would openly acknowledge. Power is not only exercised through ceremony or force, but also through absence, silence, and psychological influence. And this lesson persisted, quietly shaping behavior, governance, and political culture for generations. Fear is a powerful tool, but it is temporary. Harold ruled through subtle fear. Nobles complied, officials calculated every word, and the kingdom obeyed. But fear cannot create loyalty. It cannot inspire love or trust. It enforces obedience, yes, but it also breeds caution, hesitation, and quiet rebellion in thought if not in action. Harthacnut's return restored legitimacy, but the kingdom still carried the imprint of Harold's methods. Every cautious decision, every calculated alliance, every measure of restraint reflected the psychological footprint left behind. England had learned that authority is fragile without legitimacy, and that the absence of moral sanction cannot be overlooked forever. Harold's reign shows us that influence can endure without recognition, that authority can persist invisibly, and that the quietest kings often leave the most enduring lessons. Harold's power was invisible yet undeniable. He ruled not through spectacle, not through ceremony, and not through public admiration. He ruled through the subtle enforcement of obedience, the quiet shaping of behavior, and the calculated use of absence. Every action or inaction carried weight. Every silence conveyed authority. This invisible rule left England cautious, calculated, and attentive to unseen forces. Nobles weighed loyalty against survival, officials measured every move, and the kingdom learned to navigate the fragile balance between obedience and consequence. Harold's legacy was psychological, not physical. It persisted in the decisions of those who survived, in the whispers of councils, and in the careful orchestration of power long after his name was minimized in chronicles. History may forget him. England never did. Harthacnut's rule was a moral response to Harold's reign. Where Harold had survived through silence, absence, and fear, Harthacnut ruled through visibility, legitimacy, and moral authority. The desecration of Harold's body, the punishment for past inaction, and the public restoration of the crown were all acts designed to correct what had been tolerated. Yet the kingdom's psyche had already been shaped. Fear, silence, and cautious obedience were now embedded in political culture. Even as legitimacy returned, the memory of what had been endured lingered. Decisions were measured not only by law or tradition, but by the lessons taught by Harold's quiet authority. Power is never only about crowns or armies. It is about influence, morality, and memory. Harold ruled invisibly, yet England still remembers the shadow of his reign, a quiet but enduring lesson in the fragility of obedience, the cost of absence, and the subtle forces that shape history. England began to recalibrate after Harold's reign. Officials and nobles understood that survival and obedience could coexist with loyalty if authority was visible, predictable, and morally sanctioned. Harold had shown them the limits of fear, absence, and silence. Harthacnut demonstrated the power of legitimacy, ceremony, and presence. The kingdom adjusted its behavior quietly. Alliances were scrutinized. Loyalty was earned, not assumed. Actions were weighed carefully. Fear no longer ruled alone, but its lessons remained, informing choices and guiding strategy. Harold's reign had been short, but its psychological impact persisted. His influence was invisible yet profound, teaching caution and observation in ways that victory or public glory never could. England remembered, even as history attempted to forget. Harald Harefoot was an unseen ruler. He left no songs, no monuments, no celebrated victories. Yet he ruled, survived, and influenced behavior in ways that remain invisible but undeniable. England learned to navigate his reign with caution, compliance, and observation. Fear enforced obedience, absence maintained control, and silence became authority. Even after his death and the public reassertion of legitimacy under Harthacnut, Harold's lessons persisted. Nobles remembered, officials calculated. The kingdom moved cautiously. Influence need not be celebrated to endure. History may ignore him. England never did. The shadow of Harold's reign lingered for decades. Kings who followed, nobles who survived, and officials who remembered operated with caution born of his subtle influence. Fear, absence, and silence had enforced obedience, and these lessons endured. Even under Harthacnut, the kingdom acted with awareness of the fragile balance Harold had maintained. He was erased from glory and chronicle, yet his influence shaped behavior, alliances, and strategy. His reign demonstrates that power is not only exercised through battles, laws, or ceremonies. Influence is subtle, psychological, and enduring. Sometimes the quietest rulers leave the longest shadows. Harald Harefoot is the king you do not see, yet his story remains embedded in the culture, memory, and behavior of the kingdom he once ruled. Harald Harefoot taught without glory. He survived, ruled quietly, and left no public legacy. Yet his reign shaped England profoundly. The kingdom learned caution, careful observation, and the invisible mechanics of obedience. Fear and silence enforced authority, and these lessons endured long after his name was minimized in chronicles. Harthacnut restored legitimacy, visibility, and moral authority. But the kingdom's behavior remained subtly influenced by the invisible king who had ruled before him. Harold's reign demonstrates that power is more than crowns and armies. It is influence, memory, and psychological imprint. The quietest kings can leave the loudest lessons. The unseen rulers can shape history as profoundly as the celebrated. Harald Harefoot was one such king. His reign is a study in survival, authority, and the lasting impact of absence, fear, and silence. His story reminds us, history is written not only in grand victories and monuments, but in the invisible forces that shape human behavior and the decisions of those left behind. England still remembered Harald Harefoot, not in triumph, but in caution. For years, his subtle authority had shaped behavior. Nobles measured loyalty, officials calculated decisions, and ordinary citizens navigated the rhythms of survival under a king who had ruled quietly, yet profoundly. Fear had enforced obedience. Silence had maintained control. Absence had been a tool of power. Harthacnut restored legitimacy, but he could not erase memory. The kingdom had internalized the lessons of the invisible king. Every alliance was considered carefully. Every decree weighed against the past. Survival, obedience, and moral awareness had become part of the national psyche. Harold's reign reminds us that authority does not always need visibility to endure. Influence can be subtle, psychological, and long-lasting. And sometimes, the quietest kings teach the loudest lessons, shaping generations long after their names have faded from chronicles. Harthacnut's consolidation was more than a political necessity. It was a psychological recalibration. Under Harold, obedience had been fragile, enforced through fear and subtle manipulation. Harthacnut now transformed compliance into loyalty. Public oaths, visible authority, and ceremonial power redefined what it meant to serve the crown. Yet even as legitimacy returned, the lessons of the past remained. Nobles acted with caution. Officials observed carefully. The kingdom had learned that absence can govern, silence can control, and fear can shape behavior. Harthacnut's rule was a lesson in moral authority, but it built upon the psychological framework Harold had unintentionally established. This is the paradox of influence. A ruler may be forgotten, but the behaviors they instill persist. England remembered the cost of survival under a king who ruled quietly, without glory, but with profound psychological effect. History often overlooks these subtle lessons, but they shape kingdoms, alliances, and decisions for generations. Harald Harefoot's reign teaches us that power is not always visible. While kings are remembered for victories, coronations, and lawmaking, the quietest rulers often shape the most enduring behavior. Harold survived through fear, absence, and silence. Nobles obeyed, officials calculated, and the kingdom functioned, all without public demonstration of authority. Harthacnut restored legitimacy and visibility, but the lessons of survival remained embedded. England had learned to navigate uncertainty, to weigh consequences, and to respect authority subtly. Fear had enforced obedience, but experience had created understanding. This is the hidden legacy of a quiet king, shaping behavior, morality, and governance without a single battle or ceremonial triumph. Power is not only enforced, it is internalized, remembered, and observed. Harold's subtle influence persisted, even under the crown of his successor. Harold's reign was brief, but its human cost was real. Alfred Etheling's death, political uncertainty, and the psychological strain on nobles and officials left marks that cannot be measured. England obeyed, survived, and endured, but obedience came at a cost. Trust eroded, decisions were cautious, and alliances were tentative. Even Harthacnut's consolidation could not erase the psychological imprint of those 5 years. Nobles and officials moved carefully, aware that absence and silence could conceal danger. The kingdom learned that survival depends not just on law or force, but on understanding the invisible mechanics of power. Harold's legacy is subtle but profound. It demonstrates that a ruler's influence extends beyond death and recognition, shaping behavior, morality, and governance in ways often unseen. The quietest kings teach the loudest lessons, through survival, fear, and subtle manipulation. England internalized the lessons of Harald Harefoot. Survival under fear, obedience under uncertainty, and cautious calculation became part of the kingdom's cultural DNA. Nobles weighed loyalty carefully. Officials measured every decision. Ordinary people adapted to the rhythms of subtle authority. Even as Harthacnut restored legitimacy and moral authority, the invisible lessons of the past persisted. Harold's reign was brief, yet it left a psychological imprint that shaped governance, alliances, and decision-making for decades. History often remembers the celebrated kings, the battles won, the laws enacted. But the subtle rulers, those who shape behavior without glory, leave legacies that endure in ways far deeper than monuments or songs. Harald Harefoot was such a ruler. His reign was a quiet instruction in survival, morality, and the mechanics of obedience, teaching lessons that the kingdom could not forget. England became a psychological kingdom. Harold's rule had trained its people to think carefully, observe constantly, and weigh consequences before acting. Obedience had been enforced quietly, without celebration or visibility. Silence and absence had become instruments of authority. Harthacnut reintroduced legitimacy and moral power, but he inherited a kingdom conditioned by subtle fear and careful calculation. Nobles understood the invisible rules of governance. Officials navigated decisions with observation and caution. Ordinary citizens knew the rhythm of authority. Harold's influence was invisible, yet undeniable. The kingdom's behavior, memory, and strategy had been permanently shaped. This is the paradox of subtle power. The ruler who leaves no monuments or songs may still shape generations through the quiet imposition of authority. England learned that authority is more than law and crown. It is influence, internalized and observed. The silent king taught lessons that survived him, shaping morality, strategy, and the very psychology of governance. Harold's reign acted as an invisible curriculum. England learned how to survive under subtle authority. Nobles internalized lessons in caution. Officials measured every word and action. Ordinary people adjusted to rhythms of power enforced without spectacle. Obedience was maintained not by force alone, but by fear, absence, and the unspoken rules of survival. Even Harthacnut's visible legitimacy could not erase the behavioral patterns Harold had instilled. Every decision, every alliance, every oath was influenced by the kingdom's memory of the quiet king who ruled without fanfare. This is the essence of subtle power, shaping behavior, morality, and governance without recognition or glory. Harald Harefoot's story reminds us that authority is not only performed publicly, but also absorbed psychologically. The invisible ruler can leave the most enduring lessons, long after history attempts to erase their name. Harald Harefoot ruled through absence and survived through silence. This strategy left England obedient but cautious, compliant but distrustful. Fear was the instrument of order, and silence was the conduit of authority. His reign may have been brief and minimized in chronicles, but the behavioral and psychological imprint endured. Harthacnut's consolidation restored legitimacy, yet he inherited a kingdom conditioned by subtle lessons in survival. Nobles observed carefully. Officials acted deliberately. Ordinary citizens navigated the rhythms of authority with awareness of unseen consequences. The long shadow of absence demonstrates a profound truth. Authority is not always exercised through visible means. Influence can be silent, psychological, and enduring. The quietest kings may teach the loudest lessons, shaping history in ways that battles and ceremonies cannot. Harald Harefoot remains the unseen king. He left no victories to celebrate, no monuments to admire, no songs to remember him by, yet his reign profoundly shaped England. Through silence, absence, and fear, he maintained authority and influenced behavior. Nobles learned caution. Officials learned calculation. Ordinary people learned survival. Harthacnut restored legitimacy and visibility, but the kingdom's psychology had been molded by Harold's quiet power. The lessons of fear, silence, and absence persisted, embedded in alliances, decisions, and daily life. This is the lesson of the invisible king. Authority is more than crowns, ceremonies, or laws. It is influence absorbed, remembered, and internalized. The quietest reigns can leave the most enduring impact. Harald Harefoot may not be celebrated in history, but his subtle power echoes through the kingdom he ruled. His story reminds us that history is shaped not only by grand triumphs, but also by the invisible forces of psychology, survival, and the unspoken rules of power. The unseen king teaches the loudest lessons, leaving a legacy measured not in monuments, but in the behaviors, caution, and memory of those who survive him. History is selective, often celebrating those who triumph visibly, while overlooking the subtle influencers who shape behavior without ceremony. Harald Harefoot is one such figure. He ruled quietly, surviving threats and unrest not through valor or spectacle, but through silence, absence, and psychological mastery. England obeyed him, not because of love or legitimacy, but because survival demanded compliance. Nobles learned to weigh every decision. Officials measured every action. Ordinary people adapted to rhythms of authority that were invisible yet inescapable. Harthacnut's arrival brought legitimacy, ceremony, and moral authority, but the kingdom's psychology had already been shaped. The lessons Harold imparted, caution, vigilance, survival, persisted. Authority could be enforced quietly. Influence could be invisible. And sometimes, those who are erased from chronicles leave the deepest imprint. Harold's story reminds us that power is not always obvious. It may be silent, subtle, and uncelebrated, but it endures. To understand history fully, we must read between the lines, listen to the whispers, and consider the kings who ruled without fanfare, yet shaped the kingdom profoundly. Harald Harefoot was a silent architect of obedience. Every decision he avoided, every ceremony he skipped, every moment of absence reinforced his authority. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly effective. Nobles learned that compliance was safer than dissent. Officials calculated consequences before acting. Ordinary citizens followed the rhythms of authority instinctively. This kind of influence is invisible in chronicles and absent from songs, yet it shapes behavior more enduringly than battles or laws. Harthacnut inherited a kingdom molded by this quiet power. His consolidation of authority, though visible and ceremonial, rested on the psychological groundwork Harold had unintentionally laid. Harold's reign teaches that authority is as much about perception and behavior as it is about crowns, armies, and coronations. Power can be silent, yet its echoes endure. Influence is not always celebrated, but it is remembered in actions, decisions, and the cautious rhythms of survival passed down through generations. England bore the shadow of Harold's reign long after his death. He ruled without public spectacle, yet his influence was pervasive. Nobles, officials, and citizens internalized the rules of survival under a quiet but firm authority. Fear had enforced obedience. Absence had concealed weakness. Silence had become an instrument of control. Harthacnut's visible legitimacy changed the outward appearance of power, but it did not erase the invisible lessons of the past. Every cautious decision, every strategic alliance, every whispered consultation reflected the kingdom's memory of a king who taught without visibility, without ceremony, and without glory. Harold's story reminds us that influence is not always recorded in chronicles or celebrated in songs. Sometimes the quietest kings teach the most enduring lessons, shaping behavior, morality, and governance in ways that endure for generations. His reign is a testament to the invisible mechanics of power, subtle, psychological, and profound. Harald Harefoot's absence was not weakness, it was a tool. By remaining distant, by avoiding confrontation, by ruling quietly, he maintained control over a kingdom that might have overpowered him with rebellion. Yet absence carries a cost, trust eroded, alliances were tentative, decisions became cautious, calculated, and slow. England survived, but its obedience was measured, not wholehearted. Harthacnut would inherit a kingdom shaped not only by fear, but also by subtle behavioral conditioning. The invisible consequences of Harold's reign lingered in every council meeting, every alliance, and every policy decision. Even as legitimacy returned, the kingdom's psychology had been altered. Survival, vigilance, and careful observation were now part of England's operating system. Harold's reign teaches a profound lesson. Authority is not only visible, ceremonial, or physical. Influence can be invisible, psychological, and enduring. The kingdom remembers, even when history forgets. And sometimes, a king who leaves no glory, no victories, no monuments may still be the most powerful teacher of all. Harthacnut's arrival restored the visible crown, the ceremonies, and the moral authority that Harold had lacked. Legitimacy returned to the kingdom, and obedience was no longer enforced solely through fear or absence. Public oaths, formal recognition, and ceremonial authority redefined what it meant to serve the king. The kingdom adapted, but the lessons of the past remained. England had internalized the subtle mechanics of power Harold had imposed. Nobles acted with caution. Officials measured every word. Ordinary citizens understood the rhythm of authority. Fear had been replaced by respect, but vigilance persisted. The psychological imprint of the invisible king endured. Harold's reign may have been short, uncelebrated, and minimized in history, but it left England changed. Influence does not always require recognition. Authority is not always performed publicly. Sometimes, the quietest rulers leave the longest-lasting lessons, shaping behavior, morality, and governance far beyond their visible power. The imprint of Harold's reign is enduring because it shaped behavior invisibly. Obedience, caution, and survival became part of England's cultural DNA. Nobles weighed loyalty carefully. Officials acted with observation and foresight. Ordinary citizens learned to navigate the rhythms of authority that were not always visible, but were always present. Harthacnut's consolidation restored legitimacy and visibility, but the kingdom had already internalized the subtle lessons of the past. Fear and absence had left a psychological mark that even legitimacy could not erase. Harold teaches a lesson often overlooked. Influence does not require spectacle. Power does not require ceremonies or victories. Sometimes, the most profound rulers teach through silence, subtlety, and the invisible enforcement of behavior. England's obedience under Harthacnut was informed by the quiet authority of Harold, a king erased from glory yet remembered through action, caution, and memory. The kingdom's psychology, its careful strategies, and its cautious loyalty are all part of Harold's invisible legacy. The silent king shaped history in ways that no battle, law, or monument could achieve. Harald Harefoot's reign teaches us about the power of the unseen. No triumphs are sung, no victories celebrated, yet his influence endured. England's obedience, caution, and strategic calculation were molded quietly by fear and absence. Nobles learned to navigate invisible authority. Officials internalized rules of survival. Citizens adjusted to the subtle expectations of their king. Harthacnut's consolidation brought visibility, legitimacy, and ceremony, but the kingdom had already absorbed Harold's lessons. Power had been internalized, authority had been experienced without spectacle, and the kingdom remembered. The unseen king's story reminds us that history is more than chronicles, songs, and monuments. Sometimes the quietest rulers leave the longest shadows. Influence, behavior, and memory can endure far beyond visible authority, shaping decisions and governance for generations. Harold's reign illustrates the fragility of authority when legitimacy is absent. Fear and absence enforced obedience, but they could not inspire trust or respect. The kingdom survived, but it did so cautiously. Every alliance was measured, every decision weighed, every action observed. The fragility of authority was a lesson taught invisibly, deeply, and enduringly. Harthacnut restored the crown's moral authority, but he inherited a kingdom trained to survive subtle power. Nobles acted with deliberation. Officials moved carefully. Citizens internalized the rhythms of authority. The invisible king's lessons endured. Harald Harefoot demonstrates that authority is not only about spectacle or legality. It is about influence, psychology, and memory. Obedience can be enforced silently. Power can be shaped without glory. And the quietest reigns can leave the loudest, longest-lasting lessons. Harald Harefoot's legacy is silent but enduring. He left no celebrated victories, no monuments, no songs. Yet his reign shaped England profoundly. Through absence, silence, and subtle fear, he maintained authority and influenced behavior. Nobles learned caution. Officials learned calculation. Ordinary citizens learned survival. Harthacnut restored legitimacy, visibility, and ceremony, but the kingdom's psychology had been molded by the invisible king. Fear, silence, and absence had taught lessons that persisted, embedded in the kingdom's decisions, alliances, and culture. Harold's story teaches that power is more than crowns and battles. Authority is absorbed, internalized, and remembered. The quietest rulers can leave the loudest lessons. The unseen king can shape history as profoundly as the celebrated. His reign reminds us that history is written not only in triumphs and monuments, but in the invisible forces that shape human behavior, morality, and governance. Harald Harefoot is the king whose lessons endure in the kingdom he quietly ruled, a testament to the invisible, enduring power of subtle authority. Harald Harefoot taught without recognition. He left no songs, no monuments, no public displays of power. Yet his influence permeated every corner of England. Nobles learned vigilance. Officials learned caution. Ordinary people learned to survive subtle authority. Through absence, silence, and carefully measured actions, he imposed obedience quietly, invisibly, effectively. Harthacnut restored visible legitimacy and moral authority, but Harold's lessons endured. The kingdom's psychology had already been shaped by fear, subtlety, and the invisible rules of survival. Every council meeting, every decision, every alliance reflected the echoes of a king who ruled without spectacle, yet whose presence was felt in every shadow. History often overlooks rulers like Harold, but influence is not always celebrated. Sometimes the quietest kings leave the loudest lessons. Sometimes absence teaches more than presence, and silence speaks louder than armies. Harald Harefoot was such a king erased from glory, yet remembered in behavior, caution, and survival. England remembered Harald Harefoot, even if chronicles did not. The kingdom's memory was not of victory or glory, but of survival and caution. Nobles acted carefully, mindful of consequences. Officials deliberated slowly, aware that every word and action carried weight. Ordinary citizens learned the rhythms of subtle authority, adapting to the invisible lessons imposed during those 5 years of quiet rule. Harthacnut's reign restored legitimacy, but the kingdom had already internalized the psychology of power Harald had demonstrated. Fear, absence, and silence became embedded in behavior, alliances, and governance. The lessons of the invisible king endured, quietly shaping the kingdom's culture for generations. Harold's story reminds us that influence is often unseen. Authority is not only performed publicly, it is absorbed, remembered, and internalized. The silent ruler can shape history as profoundly as the celebrated. The invisible king leaves a legacy in behavior, caution, and decision-making, echoing long after the crown has changed hands. Fear maintained Harold's authority, but it carried a cost. Obedience under fear is fragile, trust erodes, alliances waver, decisions become cautious, calculated, and deliberate. England survived, but it was forever altered. The lessons of survival under subtle power became embedded in the kingdom's psyche. Harthacnut restored legitimacy and visibility, yet he inherited a kingdom conditioned by fear and absence. Nobles acted with deliberation, officials measured every decision, and ordinary citizens adapted to the invisible pressures of authority. Harold's subtle governance had transformed behavior, creating a kingdom that operated cautiously, even under legitimate rule. This is the paradox of subtle power. Influence can be invisible, uncelebrated, and even erased from chronicles, yet endure in behavior, alliances, and culture. The kingdom learned to survive under silence, obey under absence, and calculate under fear. Harald Harefoot's reign demonstrates that the quietest kings often leave the longest-lasting lessons, shaping morality, governance, and strategy long after they vanish from public memory. Harold's reign exposed the fragility of authority without legitimacy. Obedience enforced through fear and silence can survive, but it cannot endure without moral sanction. The kingdom learned caution. Nobles calculated loyalty. Officials considered every action. Ordinary citizens moved with awareness of unseen consequences. The crown itself, while symbolic, depended on perception as much as power. Harthacnut restored legitimacy, but the kingdom's memory persisted. Authority had been tested under absence, obedience had been enforced under fear, and the subtle psychology of governance had been indelibly altered. The fragility Harold revealed became a lesson in vigilance for those who followed. History may overlook subtle reigns, but their influence endures. Harald Harefoot ruled quietly, invisibly, yet effectively. His crown was contested, his body desecrated, and his name minimized, but his lessons, psychological and behavioral, endured. England's cautious loyalty, measured obedience, and careful strategy all bear the imprint of his silent authority. Harald Harefoot ruled without spectacle, yet his influence was profound. Every absence, every silence, every subtle enforcement of obedience shaped behavior across England. Nobles learned to observe, officials to calculate, and ordinary citizens to adapt to the rhythms of invisible authority. The lessons were internalized, psychological, and enduring. Harthacnut's consolidation reintroduced visible legitimacy, but it rested on the groundwork Harold had laid. England's cautious loyalty, deliberate governance, and careful calculation were all part of the invisible education Harold provided. Authority need not be performed publicly to endure. Influence can be absorbed, internalized, and remembered. Harold's reign reminds us that the quietest kings can leave the loudest lessons. Absence teaches, silence commands, and subtlety endures. Power is not always celebrated, but it can shape the kingdom profoundly. History may minimize his name, but the kingdom's behavior carries the evidence of his rule. The kingdom remembers Harald Harefoot, even if history forgets. England internalized his lessons in survival, caution, and subtle authority. Nobles acted deliberately. Officials measured every decision. Ordinary citizens understood the rhythm of unseen power. Fear had enforced obedience. Absence had maintained control. Silence had become authority. Harthacnut's reign restored legitimacy and visibility, but the kingdom's psyche remained shaped by the invisible king. His subtle influence endured in alliances, governance, and daily life. Behavior, memory, and caution became a part of the kingdom's culture, a testament to the lasting power of unseen authority. Harold teaches that rulers need not be celebrated to be effective. Influence is often invisible, unrecognized, and psychological, yet it can endure across generations, shaping morality, obedience, and strategy long after the crown has passed. The quietest kings, though erased from chronicles, often leave the deepest mark on history. Silence was Harald Harefoot's greatest tool. By ruling quietly, avoiding confrontation, and remaining absent at critical moments, he maintained authority without spectacle. Nobles learned caution. Officials learned calculation. Citizens learned survival. Obedience was enforced psychologically, not ceremonially. Harthacnut restored legitimacy, visibility, and moral authority, but he inherited a kingdom conditioned by subtle fear and absence. The lessons of silent authority persisted. Every council meeting, every alliance, every political decision reflected the psychological imprint of the invisible king. Harold's reign demonstrates the paradox of power. The quietest rulers often teach the loudest lessons. Influence does not need to be visible to endure. Authority is absorbed, remembered, and internalized. Behavior, culture, and governance carry the traces of kings who leave no monuments, no songs, and no public triumphs. In the end, Harald Harefoot's silent legacy endured, shaping England's psychology, strategy, and moral calculus for generations. He is a testament to the invisible, enduring power of subtle authority, and a reminder that history is written as much by behavior as by glory. Even decades after his death, Harold's shadow lingered. England's cautious obedience, measured decisions, and internalized vigilance were all shaped by his quiet reign. Fear had maintained authority, absence had concealed weakness, and silence had become a tool of governance. Nobles, officials, and citizens had internalized these lessons, and they endured under subsequent rulers. Harthacnut's consolidation restored legitimacy and moral authority, but the kingdom's psychology remained influenced by Harold's invisible methods. Every cautious glance, measured word, and calculated action was a testament to the lessons learned under the silent king. Harold's story reminds us that history is more than battles, crowns, and victories. Authority can be invisible, influence can be subtle, and lessons can endure in behavior long after names are erased from chronicles. The quietest kings often leave the longest shadows, shaping morality, governance, and culture for generations. Harald Harefoot's legacy is quiet yet enduring. He left no victories to celebrate, no monuments to admire, no songs to remember him by. Yet his reign shaped England profoundly. Through absence, silence, and subtle fear, he maintained authority and influenced behavior. Nobles learned caution. Officials learned calculation. Ordinary citizens learned survival. Harthacnut restored legitimacy, visibility, and ceremony. But the kingdom had already internalized the lessons of the invisible king. Fear, silence, and absence taught behavioral and psychological lessons that persisted, embedded in decisions, alliances, and governance. Harold's story teaches that power is more than crowns, ceremonies, or battles. Influence can be unseen, psychological, and enduring. The quietest rulers often leave the most lasting lessons, shaping morality, obedience, and governance long after their names fade from history. The Silent King reminds us that history is written not only in triumph, but in the invisible forces that shape behavior, decisions, and the very culture of a kingdom. Harald Harefoot ruled quietly, but he taught profoundly. His quiet legacy endures, echoing through the cautious actions, careful strategies, and moral calculations of those who followed. Decades after Harald Harefoot's death, England still bore the subtle marks of his reign. He ruled quietly, invisibly, and without ceremony, yet the kingdom's behavior, alliances, and governance carried the imprint of his subtle authority. Nobles moved with caution. Officials acted with deliberation. Ordinary citizens navigated rhythms of obedience learned under silence and absence. Harthacnut's consolidation restored legitimacy, visibility, and moral authority. Yet the kingdom had already internalized the lessons of survival under subtle power. Fear, absence, and silence had taught more enduring lessons than battles or proclamations ever could. Harold's story reminds us that influence is not always celebrated. Power can be subtle, psychological, and long-lasting. The quietest kings, though erased from chronicles, often leave the deepest mark, not in monuments or songs, but in the behaviors, strategies, and moral decisions of the kingdom they leave behind. To understand history fully, we must look beyond triumphs and ceremonies, into the silent currents of influence that shape kingdoms, and the invisible kings who teach lessons without glory yet leave legacies that endure. Harald Harefoot ruled through absence, and yet his authority was absolute. Every avoidance of ceremony, every silence, every unspoken expectation reinforced obedience. Nobles learned caution, officials learned calculation, and ordinary people adapted to subtle authority. England survived, but it was reshaped, psychologically, culturally, and behaviorally. Harthacnut restored visible legitimacy, yet the kingdom's subconscious memory of subtle power remained. Decisions were cautious. Alliances were measured. Behavior was calculated. Absence had become a lesson and silence a tool. This is the paradox of subtle authority. The most enduring influence is often invisible. The quietest rulers can teach the loudest lessons, shaping governance, morality, and strategy without a single public triumph. Harold's reign, though brief and minimized in chronicles, created patterns of obedience and survival that outlasted him, shaping England for generations. Harold's reign enforced obedience, but at a cost. Trust eroded. Alliances were tentative. Decisions were cautious and calculated. Survival demanded compliance, not loyalty. Fear, absence, and silence maintained control, but they left marks on the kingdom's behavior and psyche. Harthacnut restored legitimacy and moral authority, yet the kingdom had been transformed. Nobles acted deliberately. Officials observed every word. Citizens internalized the rhythms of authority. The invisible lessons of subtle power persisted, quietly shaping governance, and behavior long after Harold's death. History often celebrates the visible and forgets the quiet, but influence is not always performed publicly. It can be absorbed psychologically, embedded in culture, and remembered in decision-making. Harald Harefoot may have been erased from chronicles, but his lessons endured in the cautious, calculated actions of England's rulers and people. His reign reminds us that power is not only exercised through crowns or armies, but through subtlety, absence, and psychological mastery. The kingdom survived, adapted, and internalized those lessons, a testament to the quiet, enduring power of the unseen king. Silence was Harold's greatest tool and his most enduring legacy. He ruled without ceremony, spectacle, or public display, yet his influence shaped England profoundly. Nobles learned observation and caution. Officials learned calculation. Ordinary citizens learned survival. Authority was enforced subtly, psychologically, and invisibly. Harthacnut restored visible legitimacy, but he inherited a kingdom already molded by subtle power. Fear, absence, and silence became embedded in governance and behavior. The lessons of survival and cautious obedience endured, quietly shaping alliances, strategies, and moral decisions for generations. Harold's reign demonstrates that power need not be visible to be effective. Influence can be psychological, internalized, and long-lasting. The quietest kings, though erased from public memory, often leave the deepest mark, not in monuments, songs, or victories, but in behavior, caution, and the invisible rules that govern a kingdom. Harald Harefoot's reign transformed England into a psychological kingdom. Obedience, survival, and vigilance became embedded in behavior. Nobles calculated every alliance. Officials measured every decision. Citizens adapted to invisible authority. Fear maintained order. Absence reinforced control. Silence commanded compliance. Harthacnut restored legitimacy and ceremony, yet the kingdom's psychology had been altered irreversibly. The subtle lessons of survival and caution persisted, shaping behavior and governance for decades. England had learned that authority is not only visible, but internalized. Influence can endure quietly, invisibly, and profoundly. Harold's story teaches that history is not only written in battles, crowns, or monuments. Sometimes, the most enduring lessons come from absence, silence, and the subtle imposition of authority. The quietest kings can leave the loudest legacies, shaping morality, governance, and strategy far beyond their lifetimes. The kingdom remembered Harald Harefoot, not in glory but in behavior. His influence endured, subtly but powerfully, a testament to the lasting power of subtle authority and the unseen forces that shape history. Harald Harefoot's crown was invisible yet real. He ruled without spectacle, avoiding public confrontation and governing quietly. Nobles learned vigilance. Officials calculated every action. Citizens adapted to the rhythms of subtle authority. Fear, absence, and silence maintained obedience. Harthacnut restored visible legitimacy, yet Harold's psychological influence endured. Every council, every decision, every alliance bore traces of his subtle authority. England had been taught how to survive, obey, and calculate under a king who ruled quietly, but effectively. The invisible crown demonstrates a truth often overlooked. Influence can be silent, psychological, and enduring. History may forget names, but behavior, strategy, and governance carry the echoes of unseen kings. Harald Harefoot's reign shows us that authority is not always performed publicly, and power is not always celebrated. Sometimes, the quietest rulers teach the loudest lessons. The lessons of Harald Harefoot persisted long after his death. Obedience was cautious. Alliances were calculated. Decisions were deliberate. Fear, absence, and silence had shaped behavior, strategy, and governance. Harthacnut's legitimacy restored ceremony, but the kingdom's psychology had already been molded. Harold's reign demonstrates that authority can be invisible, psychological, and enduring. The quietest rulers leave the loudest legacies. Their influence is measured not in monuments, battles, or songs, but in behavior, morality, and strategy, in the careful calculation of those who survive them. England had learned that survival often depends on subtlety, caution, and internalized obedience. The kingdom remembered, even when chronicles minimized his name. Harold's subtle power, his invisible crown, and his quiet reign left an indelible mark, quietly shaping generations of decisions, alliances, and governance. This is the paradox of subtle authority. It may be unseen, uncelebrated, and unrecorded, yet it endures. The invisible king teaches the loudest lessons, influencing behavior long after the crown has changed hands. Harald Harefoot taught through silence. Every absence, every unspoken expectation, every subtle assertion of authority shaped behavior across England. Nobles learned to observe. Officials learned to calculate. Citizens learned to survive. Authority was absorbed psychologically rather than celebrated publicly. Harthacnut restored legitimacy, yet the kingdom had internalized Harold's lessons. Fear and absence became embedded in governance. Silence became an instrument of influence. The lessons endured in every cautious decision, measured alliance, and deliberate action. Harold's story reminds us that the quietest kings can teach the loudest lessons. Influence need not be visible to endure. Authority is absorbed, internalized, and remembered. The kingdom's behavior, strategy, and culture bear the mark of a ruler erased from glory but remembered in action. Even decades later, Harald Harefoot's shadow endured. England's obedience, caution, and internalized vigilance were shaped by his quiet reign. Fear maintained order. Absence concealed weakness. Silence commanded compliance. Nobles, officials, and citizens had learned to navigate subtle authority, and those lessons persisted under every subsequent ruler. Harthacnut's consolidation restored legitimacy and moral authority, yet the kingdom's psychology had already been conditioned. Every alliance, decision, and policy reflected the subtle lessons of the invisible king. Authority had been absorbed. Influence had endured. Behavior, culture, and governance all bore traces of Harold's quiet power. His reign demonstrates a profound truth. History is more than victories, crowns, and monuments. The quietest rulers can teach the loudest lessons, shaping morality, strategy, and obedience across generations. The unseen king leaves a legacy not of glory, but of subtle, enduring influence. A kingdom forever changed by his silent authority. Even centuries later, Harald Harefoot's influence echoes in history, quiet, subtle, and profound. He ruled without ceremony, spectacle, or public confrontation, yet his authority shaped behavior, governance, and alliances. Nobles learned caution. Officials learned calculation. Citizens learned survival. Fear, absence, and silence maintained order, embedding subtle lessons in the kingdom's psyche. Harthacnut's reign restored legitimacy, visibility, and moral authority, but the kingdom's psychology had already been molded. Every decision, alliance, and council reflected the lessons Harold imposed invisibly. The kingdom had learned to survive under subtle power, and those lessons endured across generations. Harold's story reminds us that influence is not always obvious. Power need not be celebrated to endure. Authority can be silent, psychological, and invisible, yet leave the deepest mark. The unseen king teaches lessons that persist long after monuments crumble and chronicles forget. Harald Harefoot transformed England quietly, yet indelibly. Obedience became cautious. Alliances became deliberate. Governance became calculated. Fear and absence were tools, internalized by nobles, officials, and citizens alike. England survived, adapted, and learned to navigate subtle authority, laying a foundation for behavior that persisted under Harthacnut and beyond. History may forget names, dates, and battles, but influence endures through action, memory, and psychology. Harold's reign, though brief and minimized in chronicles, shaped behavior, strategy, and governance. Authority had been absorbed. Influence had endured. The kingdom's careful loyalty, measured decisions, and internalized vigilance were all part of the invisible legacy of the Silent King. Harald Harefoot's story teaches us that power is more than visibility, glory, or law. It is influence, internalized, remembered, and enacted. The quietest rulers often leave the loudest lessons, shaping kingdoms long after their reigns end. Harold's reign came with a cost. Fear maintained obedience, but trust eroded. Alliances were tentative. Decisions were cautious, calculated, and deliberate. England survived, but the kingdom's psychology and behavior were forever altered. The lessons of survival under subtle power became part of the cultural DNA. Harthacnut restored legitimacy and moral authority, yet the subtle lessons persisted. Nobles acted with caution. Officials measured every word. Citizens adapted to rhythms of invisible authority. Harold's reign, though brief and largely forgotten, left a lasting imprint on behavior, governance, and culture. His story reminds us that the greatest influence is not always visible. Silence teaches, absence commands, subtlety endures. The unseen king shapes behavior more profoundly than any public triumph, leaving lessons that survive long after crowns, battles, and songs fade from memory. Harald Harefoot demonstrates that power need not be glorious to be effective, and that the quietest reigns often leave the deepest mark. History may forget him, but the kingdom remembers in obedience, vigilance, and subtle, enduring lessons of survival. Harald Harefoot's reign was less about conquest and more about psychology. Obedience, vigilance, and caution became part of England's cultural DNA. Nobles calculated alliances. Officials measured every decision. Citizens internalized the rhythms of authority. Fear, absence, and silence shaped behavior. The kingdom had learned to survive under subtle power. Harthacnut restored legitimacy and ceremony, but England's psychology had already been molded. The kingdom acted with careful deliberation, learned caution, and internalized authority. The invisible lessons of a quiet king endured, shaping governance and behavior long after his death. History may overlook rulers like Harold, but influence does not always need visibility. The quietest kings can leave the most enduring legacies, teaching through silence, absence, and subtle authority. Their impact can shape culture, morality, and strategy far beyond their lifetimes. Harold's story teaches that true power is sometimes quiet, subtle, and invisible, yet its echoes resonate for generations, silently shaping history. Harald Harefoot was the invisible king. No triumphs were celebrated, no victories immortalized, no songs sung in his honor. Yet his influence endured in every decision, every alliance, every cautious action. Nobles learned vigilance. Officials learned calculation. Citizens learned survival. Obedience was absorbed psychologically, rather than enforced ceremonially. Harthacnut restored legitimacy, but Harold's silent lessons had already transformed the kingdom. Fear, absence, and subtle authority became embedded in behavior. England had learned how to survive under quiet power, a lesson that persisted across generations. The unseen king's story reminds us that history is not only about battles, crowns, and monuments. Influence can be invisible, yet enduring. Authority can be absorbed, remembered, and internalized. The quietest rulers often leave the longest-lasting legacies. Harold's reign demonstrates that subtle power shapes kingdoms more profoundly than glory, triumph, or recognition. Harold's reign taught lessons that outlasted his life. Obedience became cautious. Alliances became deliberate. Decisions became calculated. The kingdom internalized the rhythms of subtle authority. Nobles observed carefully. Officials acted deliberately. Citizens learned to navigate invisible power. Fear, absence, and silence were tools that shaped behavior, strategy, and culture. Harthacnut restored legitimacy and visibility, but the kingdom's psychology had already been molded. Every cautious glance, every calculated word, every deliberate action carried traces of Harold's subtle influence. The kingdom remembered, even if history forgot. Harald Harefoot demonstrates that power is not always visible or celebrated, yet it can endure. The quietest rulers leave the loudest lessons, shaping morality, governance, and behavior far beyond their reign. Influence can be psychological, subtle, and long-lasting, a legacy often invisible, yet profound. Even after his death, Harold's shadow remained. England had learned survival, caution, and obedience under subtle power. Nobles acted deliberately. Officials measured every decision. Citizens internalized the invisible authority of a king who ruled quietly. Fear maintained order. Absence concealed weakness. Silence commanded respect. Harthacnut restored legitimacy, but Harold's psychological influence endured. Every alliance, decision, and policy carried traces of his silent reign. Authority had been absorbed. Influence had endured. Behavior, governance, and culture all bore marks of his invisible power. The Silent King teaches a timeless lesson. Influence does not require recognition, and power is not always visible. Sometimes, the quietest rulers leave the longest-lasting legacies. Harold's reign is proof that subtle authority, exercised through absence, silence, and psychology, can shape kingdoms far beyond a king's lifetime. Harald Harefoot may be forgotten in chronicles, yet England remembers. Obedience, caution, and survival had been learned under his quiet rule. Nobles calculated alliances. Officials measured decisions. Citizens adapted to invisible authority. Fear, absence, and silence shaped behavior and governance. Harthacnut restored legitimacy, yet the kingdom's psychology had already been transformed. The silent lessons of Harold's reign endured in alliances, policies, and behavior, quietly shaping strategy, morality, and governance for generations. His influence was invisible, uncelebrated, yet profound. Harold's story reminds us that history is not only written in victories, crowns, or songs. Sometimes the quietest rulers teach the loudest lessons. Authority can be subtle, psychological, and enduring. The kingdom carries the traces of kings who ruled without fanfare, leaving legacies that survive long after monuments crumble and names fade from memory. Harald Harefoot's reign is a testament to the enduring power of subtlety. He ruled quietly, invisibly, without victories or songs, yet his influence shaped England for generations. Nobles learned vigilance. Officials learned calculation. Citizens learned survival. Authority was absorbed, internalized, and remembered. Fear, absence, and silence maintained order and taught lessons that lasted far beyond his reign. Harthacnut restored visible legitimacy, but the kingdom's psychology had already been shaped by Harold's invisible rule. Every cautious decision, every careful alliance, every measured action carried traces of the Silent King's authority. England remembered, even when history forgot. Harald Harefoot teaches us that power is not always about spectacle, recognition, or glory. Influence can be psychological, subtle, and enduring. The quietest rulers often leave the loudest lessons, shaping morality, behavior, and governance long after their names fade. His story reminds us that history is not only recorded in battles or crowns, but in the invisible forces that shape kingdoms. Harald Harefoot ruled quietly, yet he taught profoundly. His quiet legacy endures, a kingdom forever changed by the silent, unseen, and enduring authority of its invisible king. History remembers kings in battles, crowns, and songs. Yet some rulers leave no monuments, no celebrated victories, only influence, subtle and enduring. Harald Harefoot was such a king. For 5 quiet years he ruled through absence, silence, and subtle authority. Nobles learned vigilance, officials measured every word, and ordinary citizens adapted to invisible power. Fear maintained order, silence became law. Harthacnut restored legitimacy, but the kingdom had already absorbed Harold's lessons. His reign reminds us that power is not always visible, and influence does not require glory. The quietest kings often teach the loudest lessons. Harold's legacy endures in behavior, strategy, and morality, a kingdom subtly shaped by the invisible king. Silence spoke, absence commanded, and subtlety lasted longer than any battle or crown, echoing across generations.